Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to another great stream on my channel. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at the German-Ottoman relations between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And for the stream, I'm very lucky to be joined by Apostolic Majesty. How are you, AM?
Hello, Beat. I'm doing okay, and I'm very happy to be on your channel, and it's great that we can collaborate again. So thank you very much.
Certainly. And so just to sort of go over the title I went with for this stream, Drang, Nach, Osten, some German roughly translates to drive towards the east. Just to hopefully I've not caused too much confusion by going with this title, because most people associate it with Germany's sort of relationship or history with expansion and colonization into Eastern Europe. But the topic we're talking about tonight, when you actually look into it, this term is also bandied about there in terms of Germany's sort of interest or in the Orient, so to speak. So same term, but just a different context.
Yes, I think there are very sort of explicit associations between the drive towards the east. I mean, when I saw that title, obviously I can't anticipate what your central thrust is going to be for the conversation, but I thought you might have been alluding to the possibility that the Germans were going to try and create the Ottoman Empire as their equivalent to what the Japanese did to Manchuria in the 1930s, but perhaps I'm reading too much into it. A sort of play on words that occurred to me was the title Drang, Nach, Osman, which would roughly translate as drive towards the Ottomans. So that gave me a chuckle, but yeah.
No, that would have been a great alternate title, and just I know I didn't think of it first, but yeah, no, and that idea of sort of the Ottomans being like a Japanese Manchuria, and yeah, my view isn't a million miles away from that, because it's obvious the Ottomans are are waning, and the Germans are like the new reinvigorated great power, and ultimately the Germans do things to help the Ottomans out, but obviously it's not out of any kind of charity. They've got their own strategic interests which they can get from this relationship. So so I mostly want to focus on the sort of Wilhelmine period, so when Kaiser Wilhelm II comes in 1888 until World War One. But obviously there's a bit of a relationship between the two beforehand, during the sort of 1871 to 1890, where obviously you have the Russo-Turkish War, where Russia wins this sort of great victory over the Turks, and is pretty much going to carve them up in the Balkans. But of course, Bismarck intervenes and organizes the Congress of Berlin, where the great powers sort of mediate this issue. And though it's still a defeat for the Ottomans and loss of territory, they're saved from the complete disaster that the original Treaty of San Stefano would have brought upon them. I remember that we actually discussed this topic, I think, a couple of years ago when I first started streaming on YouTube. We were talking about Abdul Hamid and the sick man of Europe. Is there anything you want to sort of add to that regarding the Russo-Turkish War or the Congress of Berlin?
Nothing other than to say that Abdul Hamid II really precipitated many of the events of this period. He comes in 10 years before Kaiser Wilhelm does. In reality, he comes off at the back of a coup, which helps precipitate the events around the Congress of Berlin. But it'd be interesting to contrast the views of, say, for example, the German establishment and Otto von Bismarck in the preceding 2 decades to the policies which you intimated about Wilhelmine Germany. In terms of actually going back to a previous example, I think the first thing that actually comes to mind is the prospect in the 1780s that the Prussians and the Ottomans would actually ally against the Austrians. So there's a bit of history to this, really, from the inception of Prussia as a great power, but obviously far more people are associated with this period of collaboration.
Yes, I believe you're alluding to, isn't that the period when Joseph I, I think, was intriguing to try and annex Bavaria, and he was challenged by Frederick the Great, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, Joseph II was in alliance with Catherine the Great, and there was a plan in the 1770s and 1780s to partition the Ottoman Empire between them. indeed, if you sort of read a lot of diplomatic discourse at the time, there's the question of, okay, well, is it in the interests of European civilization to allow the Habsburgs to become an empire on the Danube and annex modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, etc., and let the Russians basically take over Constantinople and Greece? And then, of course, in the 1750s, you come to this idea of Baudin and the whole idea of the balance of power. Really, you can say the Ottoman Empire and its how it figures into the whole European context is really the origin of the whole concept of the balance of power, because it really is, in terms of its religion, the ethnic makeup of the empire, its institutions, slavery, etc. It really is the antithesis of much of the rest of "quote unquote" civilized Western Europe. And so its existence sort of lingers on as a result of, you can say, the interpretation of this whole notion of the balance of power. And it's perhaps this notion and the application of this principle in foreign policy that allows the Ottoman Empire to linger on for as long as it did into the early 20th century.
I don't know, certainly. Thank you for that. So just to look at a little bit with Bismarck's sort of attitude towards the Ottoman Empire post the Congress of Berlin. So he maintains reasonably good relations with them, and ultimately, he sends the very first military mission under General Major Otto Carlo in 1883, and although at the same time, he doesn't want to piss the Russians off too much. So obviously, you've got the 1887 reinsurance treaty, where they both mutually agree not to interfere in wars with third countries, and that includes Russian operations on the Bosphorus, and so ultimately, Bismarck also, I think, sends some industrial investment that way as well. So he wants to maintain an interest, but he's not like super interested in them, because ultimately he doesn't want to alienate the other powers. And it's only when Wilhelm comes along that you start to see this increased interest. And so Wilhelm makes his very first state visit to Constantinople in 1889. Which Bismarck did not approve of at all. And there's that famous expression of Bismarck's, the whole Orient is not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. So he very much saw this whole endeavor as a bit of a stupid risk. But I want to do a bit of a reading, because the main book I've sort of used for this stream was the Berlin-Baghdad Express by Sean McMeekin, and it's quite an interesting book on sort of Ottoman-German relations around this time. And so I'm just going to do a bit of reading, and if you want to interject at any point, please feel free to do so.
Okay.
So, what was a diplomatic nightmare for Bismarck, however, was for the young Kaiser very good fun. Wilhelm was feted everywhere he went in Constantinople, even by the English colony, which took him in as one of their own. Aside from the salutes and cannonades, there was enough political intrigue in 4 days to fill a book, addressing his German counterparts in accordance with Islamic tradition through a pair of interpreters. Sultan Abdul Hamid took the impressionable young Kaiser into his confidence, complaining of palace plots and flattering embassy gossip, and more pointedly, the designs of other European sovereigns on his domains. Because Germany had not, as of yet, displayed similar territorial ambitions, Wilhelm remembered the Sultan telling him, with an air of conspiracy, that my visit would make these powers very nervous. This was music to the ears of an ambitious young emperor keen to make his mark on the world. In the young Kaiser's ostentatious state visit to Constantinople in 1889, we can see those qualities which would soon both fascinate and repel the world. On the one hand, it is easy to see why the visit was so well received. Wilhelm's childlike curiosity and capacity for wonder, his ability to be fascinated by new sights and sensations, from the Ottoman caiques and palaces to the gracious, delightful, rhythmic dances of the Circassians and the Sultan's harem, all this went over very well with Constantinople's residents. An ancient caravan people known for their hospitality to travellers, Turks have always responded well to visitors' attentions and compliments. Kaiser Wilhelm did not disappoint them, thanking the Sultan effusively for his splendid hospitality, and declaring himself much moved by the feelings of cordiality and sympathy shown towards their Majesties both by the Sovereign of Turkey and his subjects. The Kaiser then gave the Sultan's Grand Vizier a diamond-set Prussian Order of the Eagle. The flip side of the flattery on display during the Kaiser's state visit was Wilhelm's vanity and insecurity, his need to be the centre of attention, which has been remarked on by nearly all his biographers. Born in the breech position after an agonising 10-hour delivery, which his mother barely survived, the future Kaiser suffered nerve damage that crippled his left arm, which by adulthood was 6 inches shorter than the right and essentially useless. As a result of his deformity, Wilhelm could not even cut his own meat without help, let alone handle weapons like the soldier he was wanted to be. The young Kaiser had thus grown up with a very large chip on his shoulder, a sense that he always had to prove himself and win a claim. Kaiser Wilhelm, it was said, had to be the stag at every hunt, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. This was not a man likely to resist the lure of Oriental gifts and blandishments. The trip to Constantinople also highlighted Wilhelm's reckless sense of statecraft, born of his restless and balanced character, able to muster up sudden enthusiasms on a moment's notice. Wilhelm yet lacked the ability to focus on essentials or note contradictions. It is of more than passing historical interest, for example, that the Kaiser befriended not only the soon-to-be notorious Bloody Sultan on this inaugural visit to the Ottoman capital, but also Theodor Herzl, the Viennese journalist, usually considered the father of Zionism. Converted by Herzl with astonishing swiftness to the Zionist cause, the Kaiser promptly lobbied Sultan Abdul Hamid on Herzl's behalf. It does not seem to have occurred to young Wilhelm that the Sultan's Muslim subjects may not have viewed the prospect of further Jewish settlement in Palestine favourably, or that the Sultan Caliph of Sunni Islam might have presented this officious intervention in Ottoman religious affairs. Nor does the Kaiser seem to have given much thought to how exactly this meddling served the German national interest. By Bismarck's cool and careful indifference to the Orient, the Kaiser had now substituted the emotional improvisations of amateur hour. These in question would never be the same again. The Kaiser, to be sure, did not follow up directly on his overtures to either the Sultan or the Zionists. His attention characteristically wandered elsewhere soon after returning home from Constantinople. Still, Wilhelm's 1889 trip was a harbinger of things to come. The aging Bismarck was pushed out of office in March 1890, ostensibly because his reactionary predilections went out of step with the more progressive Reichstag elected that year. But the Kaiser was equally keen on breaking the Iron Chancellor's hold on foreign policy. Within weeks of Bismarck's fall, the reinsurance treaty with Russia was allowed to lapse, despite open Russian overtures in Berlin in favour of renewal. A natural alliance between the two reactionary powers had been replaced, perhaps quite needlessly, by an antagonism which would dominate two world wars. Not only did the lapse open the door for France's courting of a defensive alliance with Russia, it also put the Tsar's diplomats on notice that the Germans would no longer acquiesce in Russian designs on the Straits. Had the Kaiser made an effort to renew Bismarck's reinsurance treaty, it is possible the Russian government would have ignored the Kaiser's flirtations with the Ottoman Sultan and refrained from rushing headlong into French arms for fear of an out-of-control Germany. Instead, Wilhelm's state visit to Constantinople, followed by the expiration of the reinsurance treaty, confirmed the Russians' worst fears about German intentions at the port, with momentous consequences for the European strategic balance. Considering the serious diplomatic price Germany may have paid for the Kaiser's dalliance with the Sultan in 1889, it is peculiar that 9 years passed before Wilhelm bothered to visit his friend Abdul Hamid again. The Kaiser's Oriental fixation, it would seem, was only one of his passing fancies, which had evaporated as quickly as it came over him. It is true that following the Sultan's repression of an Armenian uprising in August 1896, Wilhelm famously sent a signed photograph of himself to Abdul Hamid to mock the latter's birthday, just as everyone else in Europe was condemning the Kaiser's friend as the Bloody Sultan and Abdul the Damned. It was less well known, however, that the Kaiser also conspired at this very time with the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to reach an agreement on the partition of the Ottoman Empire in the case of its collapse, with the aim of tempting Russia to abandon her alliance with France. Luckily for Wilhelm's relations with Abdul Hamid, Lord Salisbury quickly dropped the idea, and the news of the Kaiser's approach to Salisbury was not leaked to the press. Still, Wilhelm never forgot the charms of Constantinople. When at last he returned to the Bosporus in October 1898, there was little left to restrain the Kaiser from a full-blown diplomatic offensive. Old Bismarck had died early that year, banishing any lingering qualms the Kaiser might have felt over pursuing his more assertive foreign policy. None of the great man's successors in the Chancellery or Foreign Office, Caprivi, Holstein, Marshall, Hohenlohe, or Bülow, had yet figured out how to rein in the Kaiser's exuberance. Alarm had recently been growing in Britain about the Kaiser's burgeoning Weltpolitik, from his notorious encouragement of the rebellious anti-British Boers in South Africa with the Kruger telegram in 1896 to the German naval expansion program began in 1897. But if anything, the disdain Wilhelm's English cousins increasingly felt for him only goaded him on further in his efforts to upstage them. And so Wilhelm resolved not only on a state visit to the Ottoman capital, but to make a grand tour of the Orient, taking in Rhodes, Malta, Jerusalem, Lebanon, and Damascus. As if to underscore the historic nature of the Kaiser's geopolitical voyage, it was launched on the 100-year anniversary of Napoleon's invasion of France, which had inaugurated the first great age of European Orientalism. Napoleon's invasion had been a disaster for the Ottoman Empire, showing up the military inferiority of the Muslim world against European armies. Although the French forces were ultimately repulsed, it was due only to British intervention. The Kaiser's visit, by contrast, was friendly and by invitation, but in its way, it was just as portentous as Napoleon's invasion. A throng of Western reporters followed the Kaiser almost everywhere he went, recording the impressions he made and speculating wildly on his motives. It seemed impossible Wilhelm was really just making the rounds and seeing the sights. Was the Kaiser seeking to shore up the Sultan's rule and frustrate Russian, British, and French designs on his domains? Or was Wilhelm himself staking a claim to the Ottoman inheritance? The Kaiser's exuberant behaviour did little to quell these speculations. In Constantinople, Wilhelm presented to the Ottoman people a huge and ornate fountain, which still stands in the Hippodrome. To the Sultan, he wished to have sent a Prussian rifle of the latest design, on which the Ottoman coat of arms was specially mounted. To the Kaiser's chagrin, however, Abdülhamid declined at first to receive his gift, apparently because a rumour had reached his ears that Armenian terrorists were conspiring to kill him with a bomb smuggled into his palace. Alas, Wilhelm himself brought the Sultan his gift weapon in person in a trunk carefully protected by a wrought iron fire screen, which Abdülhamid inspected with an unmistakable air of elevated mistrust. To appease his suspicions, the Kaiser bowed before the Sultan with great ceremony and slowly opened the ominous casket with his own hands. Finally reassured that no bombs were inside, Abdülhamid fondly examined the Kaiser's gun. For the rest of the evening, amity and good cheer prevailed. The curious incident in Constantinople was hardly an encouraging omen for the Kaiser's trip. If the paranoid Abdülhamid did not trust Wilhelm in his own home, he could hardly be reassured when the Kaiser rode triumphantly into Jerusalem on the 29th of October 1898, with a specially cut breach in the city's walls in a Prussian field marshal's uniform and mounted on the black charger as if he were conquering the Sultan's city rather than just visiting it as his guest. The ostensible purpose of the visit to Jerusalem was to help dedicate the new Church of the Redeemer, constructed by German Protestants, but Wilhelm also made a point of pleasing German Catholics by taking into his protection the Dormitio Vitae Virginis, or presumed site of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. So overwhelmed was Wilhelm when he visited the site that he immediately placed himself, his army, and his empire in the service of the Mother of Christ. The Kaiser then telegraphed Pope Leo XIII to make his official protection of Catholics in the Holy Land. Not that Wilhelm was playing favourites. To please North German Protestants, he next offered his sovereign protection to a German evangelical Weihnachtskirche in Bethlehem. Finding intrigue upon intrigue, Wilhelm received Theodor Herzl again on the 2nd of November in Jerusalem. Herzl wanted the Kaiser to charter a company to promote German Jewish colonization of Ottoman Palestine, and of course to win the Sultan's backing for the project. The first International Zionist Congress, slated to convene later that month in Basel, would benefit enormously from an endorsement from the Kaiser. Wilhelm, because of his presumed influence on the Sultan. As always, the Kaiser was swayed quite easily by Herzl's arguments, assuring him solemnly that your movement is based on a sound, healthy idea. There's room here for everyone. My personal observances convinced me that the land is arable, only provide water and trees. In the end, Wilhelm was warned by the Ottoman Foreign Minister, Ahmed Tevfik, that Abdülhamid was not friendly to Zionism and quietly dropped the idea. But the Kaiser's public embrace of Zionism in the holiest city of Christianity and under Muslim rule was dizzying enough, whether sincere or not. How could he ever top this? As it turned out, quite easily. Following a brief stopover in Beirut, the Kaiser made another ceremonial entrance, this time into Damascus. Wilhelm was intoxicated by the first truly Arab town he had ever visited, with its characteristic concealed courtyards and their splashing fountains, its fascinating bazaars, and the whole charm of the Saracenic architecture and the Arabs' mode of life. Wherever Wilhelm went, he recalled his State Secretary Bernard von Bülow. The populace welcomed him with a peculiar cry of greeting, a long drawn-out repeated guttural bellow of lululu, 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 and a monotonous noise intoxicated him as though it had been hashish. In trance, Wilhelm laid a wreath on the tomb of the great Muslim warrior Saladin and hung a lamp of solid silver before ordering that a mausoleum of the finest marble be built around it at his expense. Moved by the Kaiser's honouring of a great hero of Islam, the city's leading cleric, Sheikh Abdullah Effendi, organised a banquet in Wilhelm's honour on the 8th of November 1898. In one of the most notorious in the career marked by notorious speeches, the Kaiser paid gushing tribute to the medieval hero of Islam as one of the most chivalrous rulers of all times, the great Sultan Saladin, a knight without fear or fault. Making the obvious leap from Saladin to the current Sultan, Wilhelm next saluted the great Abdülhamid. May the Sultan, Wilhelm declaimed with dramatic flourish, and his 300 million Muslim subjects scattered across the earth, who venerate him as their caliph, be assured that the German Kaiser will be their friend for all time. Had Kaiser Wilhelm gone round the bend, it was one thing to offer protection to Christians in the Holy Land, although even this sort of manoeuvre could have serious consequences, as Napoleon III had discovered when his courting of Levantine Christians in 1852 they had lit the spark which had led to the Crimean War. But here was a powerful Christian sovereign declaring a proprietary interest in nearly all the subjects of the Ottoman Middle East, no less than 3 Christian denominations, the Jews of Palestine and all the Muslims to boot. this was not all. By offering his protection via the Sultan to 300 million Muslims around the world, Wilhelm was meddling in the affairs of other powers and Muslim subjects, not least French North Africa, Muslim Central Asia, and the British Empire, which alone contained some 100 million Muslims spread out over British India, Egypt, and the Gulf states. Then, too, there was Persian and southern Mesopotamia, where Shia Muslims had never accepted the Ottoman Sultan as their caliph. The wonder the Kaiser State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Bernard von Bülow, tried desperately to edit the text of Wilhelm's speech before it was released to the press, for fear of arousing suspicion in Paris, London, and St. Petersburg. But it was too late. The German ambassador in Constantinople, Baron Marshall, had already given the text to the Wolf News Agency on a direct order from His Majesty. What was the Kaiser thinking? Interestingly, does not exist a record of the Kaiser's thoughts during the historic tour of the Orient in letters he dispatched, improbably to his dear friend Nicky in St. Petersburg. Judging from this correspondence, Wilhelm's strategic goal was to convince both Sultan and Tsar that the true enemy was Great Britain, thus threatening Germany's great rival for global supremacy with the pincer movement. The trump card, Wilhelm believed, was the Muslim world, whose fury had most recently been unleashed against British intervention on behalf of the Christians in Crete in 1897. What an effect this active pillage has had on the Mahometan world, Wilhelm wrote the Russian Tsar from Constantinople on the 20th of October 1898. But a terrible blow to the prestige of the Christian in general in the eyes of the Mussulman, a rule of hatred you can hardly imagine. Taking Nicky into his confidence as if the two were already allies in battle with perfidious Albion, the Kaiser told the Tsar to remember what you and I agreed upon at Peterhof, never to forget that the Mahometans were a tremendous card in our game in case you or I were suddenly confronted by a war with certain meddlesome power. British India, that is, could be brought low by an Islamic jihad launched by either Sultan or Tsar, who was himself the master of millions of Mahometans. The idea that Russia was just as vulnerable to Muslim unrest as Britain does not seem to have occurred to Wilhelm, not yet anyway. Tossing discretion aside, Kaiser Wilhelm now revealed to the Tsar the underlying motivation for his Muslim charm offensive. He had fallen in love with Islam. Wilhelm decried the ostentation of the Christian churches of the Holy Land, which contrasted unfavourably with the simple adornments of the mosques. Fetish adoration, the Kaiser wrote to Nicholas II from Jerusalem, has created a supreme contempt for Christians with the Muslims, and Wilhelm was inclined to agree with them, all but proclaiming his own conversion. The Kaiser now confessed to the Tsar, my personal feeling of leaving the holy city was that I felt profoundly ashamed of all the Muslims, and that if I had come there without any religion at all, I certainly would have turned to Mahometan. Thus was born Haji Wilhelm, the mythical Muslim emperor of Germany, who could cut such a grandiose yet confusing figure on the world stage in the decades to come. Following the visit to Damascus, rumours of the Kaiser's conversion to Islam spread wildly throughout the bazaars of the Middle East, helped along by the discovery of passages in the Quran which showed that the Kaiser had been ordained by God to free Muslims from infidel rule. It helped that Germany, unlike Britain and France, was still relatively little known in the Ottoman lands. The image was a tabula rasa onto which German propagandists could write whatever they wished. The Kaiser had now given them the script. Germany, led by Haji Wilhelm, would be the Western protector of Islam, saving this noble faith from the depredations of European imperialism. Like the Kaiser's conversion, it was a half-truth at best. Germany had her own Muslim colonies, principally in West Africa, which put the lie on the claim that her hands were clean, but contradictions had never bothered visionaries. Where before the budding pan-German activists of the Kaiserreich had little geographical focus for their imperial striving, aside from an unedifying disputes with British over poor scraps of African territory, which few Germans really wanted to settle anyway, the Kaiser's Grand Tour of 1898 gave the movement the inspiration it needed. Wilhelm himself may not have been clear on the goals of the Ottoman offensive. He changed his mind too often, but pan-German theories easily remedied this deficiency. Inspired by the Kaiser's powerful vision, a new generation of intellectuals and adventurers would sketch in the contours of Germany's Drang, Nach, Osten. So I think there's an awful lot to unpack there. In terms of what I think on this, I mean, this sort of Wilhelm's interest in sort of, Islam and Orientalism, but, Orientalism is something I'm very much interested in, and I've done other streams on my channel about. And obviously you've got this idea of Wilhelm, he wants to invest in the idea of Weltmacht, or making Germany a world power. And, Orientalism by this point had very much been an Anglo-French affair. So I can't help but feel that Wilhelm believes by engaging in Orientalism, this is some sort of legitimating factor in making Germany a world power. And also, why is he, pandering to all these different groups here, the Muslims, but also the Christians and the Jews? It's, again, alluding to this comparison you've made, like the Japanese and Manchuria. It's almost like, Wilhelm or Germany is going to fill the void in the Middle East left by the Ottomans, and sort of become the new overlord and take these various groups at its own clients. I mean, is there anything you want to say to that at all, or?
First, I'd like to say I like that that phrase referencing the Kaiser's dramatic diplomatic overtures that he needed to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. I like that. I haven't heard of that before. I prefer, when I was mentioning Manchuria earlier, I was sort of trying to anticipate your arguments. I'm not really quite convinced of it myself, but I think your pragmatic reading actually, as far as I'm concerned, is more convincing than Sean McMeekin's argument, which you presented here. Because, yes, it wasn't just a Kaiser-centric affair, the whole notion of Orientalism. The French were very well established in Levant. They were the pervasive influence in the Vilayet of Beirut. They had been responsible for constructing most of it. There were French settlers there. There was a large Francophone Catholic missionary presence there. And indeed, that connection goes back long before this period, all the way up until the 16th century. By that same token, the British had been far more decisive in the history before World War I of propping up the Ottoman Empire, which everyone seems to overlook in the sort of build up to World War I. If there's one figure or two figures who are responsible for the propping up of the Ottoman Empire, you have to look at Lord Palmerston in the Crimean War and Disraeli during the Balkan crisis. In fact, much of the borders that the Ottoman Empire had between 1878 and the Balkan Wars of 1911 to 1912 to 1913 are owed in part thanks to Disraeli. Indeed, the British had the controlling interest in the Ottoman Debt Authority. So all of these things, again, push back against this idea that the Kaisers had this sort of unique association with the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, you mentioned, or Sean McMeekin references, not only his patronage of Muslims, but his patronage of various Protestant churches that we see throughout the Ottoman Empire, the few that there are. Well, of course, I've already alluded to the fact that the French had a long pervading influence with Catholicism. You've already brought up on previous streams how the Russians were interested in propping up the Orthodox communities. And even the British have been responsible for propping up the Assyrian churches, and this is an anticipation of the cipher or the putting to the sword of the Assyrian Christians. So yes, you're correct in the sense that Orientalism was a European sort of imperial affair. It wasn't a German affair. I also think, do you think it's fair, Sean McMeekin's appraisal of the Kaiser? Because I think he's been very unflattering to the Kaiser in saying that he had a childish fascination with the pageantry of the Circassians, and he was submitted to this, whirlwind romance of, Orientalism, where he's, infatuated just by the architecture of Damascus, and he is compelled, therefore, by, the awe and simplicity of the mosques to go and convert to Islam. Because, of course, we have the letter in the Willie Nicky correspondence that, had I been born with any option, I would have chosen Islam. But given his severe sort of almost monk-like Christianity later on, I don't believe that's true. I believe the Kaiser is an antiquarian. He was an archaeologist. He was fascinated with history, he loved history. And I think, again, the issue of focusing on the Kaiser specifically, as Sean McMeekin has here, is to believe that essentially the Kaiser's own propaganda, oddly enough, which Sean McMeekin seems to be aware of, which is that the Kaiser is all-powerful. The personal rule of the Kaiser following Bismarck has really taken on a life of its own, and that is the driving force in German foreign policy, when the real German interest in the region seems to be far more mundane and materialistic. I think my biggest contention with the passage you brought up was something earlier on, was about the end of the Reassurance Treaty and fixating it on the Ottoman dalliance in 1889. That's not my reading at all, and it's not the reading of Christopher Clark, who's probably the most eminent Prussian historian writing in English. His view, and I've been convinced by this view, is that Wilhelm rather was induced by a long-standing anti-Bismarckian animus in the Foreign Office, led by the political secretary of the Foreign Office, von Holstein, who you've mentioned, and Holstein, who you've mentioned, and Holstein believe that the Austrian and Russian alliances couldn't be maintained simultaneously because it represented an absolute contradiction. And so it was therefore necessary to jettison the Russians in order to shore up the Austrian alliance. And so from the view of foreign policy, it was the Austrian alliance that was the sort of the paramount interest of the German foreign establishment here and not the Ottoman association here. Indeed, you can't really look at the Ottoman sort of role as decisive until perhaps much later. I also think if there is a fanciful element, which I agree with in terms of the reading of Sean McMeekin, it is the idea of the Kaiser being this patron to the 300 Mohammedans, as he'd refer to them, that the Kaiser should always be your most faithful and trustworthy friend. Seldom in the history of Islam, since really the Arab conquest, has there been this united rule or fetishization of the Caliph. Indeed, you would have thought the fact that the Caliph is supposed to be the shadow of God on earth and the deputy for sort of vice regent of Allah and the descendant of the Prophet, that he would have that grandiose association and Muslims would be attracted to his divine ordering of the world. That's not true. Even among Sunni Muslims, of which Abdul Hamid again nominally claimed leadership as Caliph, that was still contentious. Say, for example, the Sunni Muslims in India have their own very distinct tradition, and deference to the Mughal emperors before them. Indeed, you can look to, say, for example, the Central Asian Muslims who were brought up very briefly in terms of the reference to the Tsar and the German Kaiser sort of bringing down India, which again is actually allusion to a much older plan by another Tsar, the Cossack plan of Tsar Paul I. Many of those Muslims didn't look to the Caliph in Constantinople. Instead, they looked to the Emir of Bukhara. Bukhara in Central Asia, in many ways, is kind of a holy city for Muslims. So I have many issues with what's been brought up here, and I like your sort of pragmatic sort of retelling of it as a European Oriental affair rather than this childlike Kaiserish fantasy.
Thank you for that. Just to cap back on a few things. So I'm quite familiar with McMeeking's writings, because I own and have read most of his books. And in general, I think in terms of his thought process, I think he's quite realistic. I think he's very practical when he looks at history, and I don't think he has time for anything that he thinks is fanciful or anything of that nature.
Indeed, and I've also read McMeekin extensively, and I believe you and I have discussed him elsewhere with specific regard to his history of the Russians and the Stalinist Empire. So, having not read this book before, I find this assessment rather interesting. Gives me a bit of whiplash.
Well, you probably intimated already, but one of the McMeekin's sort of main angles with the book is that the principal interest Wilhelm had, or the Germans had, is using the Ottoman Empire to, as they would sort of make an effort to during the World War One, to launch this great global jihad against the Entente powers, and that's a pretty strong angle he looks at in the book, and it's something I want to explore a bit more on this stream. But I also want to look at other aspects of the German relationship, as you mentioned, the more mundane reasons as well. But also, I just want to also address a point you made about the Caliphate. I very much agree with you. I think the Caliphate at one point had been this sort of great office. It was essentially like a king of the Arabs, but as time goes on, it very much declines in authority, especially after you have the Mongol sack of Baghdad in the 13th century. And and it should also be noted that what was one of the other titles the old caliphs used to have? It was the Emir al-Mu'minin, which translates as the Commander of the Faithful, and that's a title that very much falls out of favor much later into the history of the Caliphate. So again, that just shows you, the office is now just a symbolic leadership of the Muslim community. It ceased, being this sort of grand leader of jihad.
Well, more so than that, Abdul Hamid II is the exception in all of this. He's one of the few active sultans we have really after the 17th century. He wants to buttress his association with the rank of caliph because he's appealing at a time where the Ottoman Empire is disintegrating, and from the point of view of the Sublime Porte or the Ottoman central administration, all of the subgroups and their ethnic minorities and Christians are fifth columnists within the empire, especially those associated with Russia. And so he reinforces the idea of his association with the leader of the faithful, or the caliph, and he brings up the Kurds and his Hamidian regiments to commit massacres against the Armenians. And these aren't affairs that we can look over. These are incidents where you have the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of thousands. So these are horrific events in the history of the Middle East. And it's Abdul Hamid II who is really an instigator against this. He stands as a novel figure in modern Ottoman history as being an active sultan, driving events. He's brought to power as a result of a royal self-coup, and ultimately he is deposed as a result of a coup. Whereas before, Ottoman sultans and caliphs were so politically inert, they were literally kept in the cage in terms of the reference to these being harem sultans. They were brought up their entire life in the harem, forbidden to leave, and seldom did they leave when they became sultan. Indeed, the whole succession system of the Ottoman Empire, or agnatic succession, based it around where you had a system of the eldest member of the House of Osman, not primogeniture, being the pervading sort of notion. And that, again, essentially meant that you had these middle-aged or decrepit old men becoming sultans, having led a sheltered and isolated life, but by design. It should be pointed out, to ensure that other forces within the Topkapi Palace control events. So this sudden sort of reassociation of the Ottoman Empire with the position of caliph is, again, just a novelty. It's not an established historical tradition that you can go back and say that the Kaiser can realistically count on this and be anything other than some sort of idealistic fool, which many interpreted him as for this reason. But I believe, like I said, you're robbing the Kaiser of a lot of sort of intellectual and political agency if you're going to determine that as the driver of German foreign policy, which of course it was not.
Well, no, certainly. As I've intimated, I think it was an element that was there, but as you've alluded to, there were obviously more practical elements as well. And so, what I want to move on, just exploring this again, this idea of Orientalism, a very prominent figure around this sort of time in terms of German Orientalism, and someone who would actually become very influential on Wilhelm and his interest in the empire, is a figure over on the left called Baron Max von Oppenheim. So he belonged to the Oppenheim banking family, and he meets Wilhelm at quite a young age when he was in the Prussian army, and but they meet later on. But he sort of trains as a lawyer, but he ultimately finds he's not really cut out professional life, and he goes off exploring around the Orient. Like he goes to the Maghreb, goes to Morocco, goes to Constantinople. Sort of does this in the 1880s and 1890s, and he sort of does this in between being a civil servant. And what he later does is he relocates to Cairo, where he kind of goes native. He lives in a house amongst locals rather than staying in a European residence, and he would sort of stay there for about the next sort of 17 years to about 1909, and he would sort of travel around the Orient from there and immerse himself in its culture and society. And he also became sort of a noted archaeologist as well, and so he travels through the Syrian desert to Basra, and he also goes into the lands of the Bedouin as well, and spending time with the Shamar clan, who were a client of the Ottomans themselves. And so he would write a lot on his sort of travel writings as well. And in terms of the archaeological discoveries he makes, he discovers a site in northeastern Syria called Tel Halaf, though he doesn't start excavating it until about 1911. But despite his interest, he didn't actually contribute very much to the field of Oriental studies, though his experience made him valuable because the German Foreign Office decided to take him on as an agent of theirs. One problem, though, is his background, because the Oppenheim family were Jewish. His mother was actually Catholic, so he did convert formally to Catholicism, but this ethnic background of his always caused him some level of enmity with the Foreign Office, because they weren't fans of hiring people of that background. So he's given a paid post at the German consulate in Cairo, and ultimately he would actually enter into some correspondence and even would come to meet Wilhelm again. And there's just a little quote I want to get. One moment. So, okay. So this is von Oppenheim, writing in a dispatch in a journal in 1899. In Damascus, as on my further travels, I was struck by the powerful impression the visit of His Majesty the Kaiser had made on the Mohammedans of Syria, and it was not difficult to observe what a particular fine reputation the German name was endowed with. Now more than ever, German businessmen in Beirut, Damascus, and Aleppo have assured me that the blessing of His Majesty's visit has expanded their business opportunities in tangible measure. The wreath which His Majesty has laid at the tomb of Saladin in Damascus has been enshrined as a relic in a glass case. A memorial tablet commemorating the Kaiser's visit was placed in a special protective display case in the glorious temple to Jupiter in Baalbek. And so ultimately, this sort of assessment given by Oppenheim captures Wilhelm's attention, and von Oppenheim is invited to dinner with Wilhelm in 1900 at Potsdam, and Wilhelm is so impressed with Oppenheim's knowledge and experience that he promotes him to Legationsrat, or chief legal counsel. And for the next several years, Oppenheim, once every summer, would be invited back to dine with the Kaiser every summer to report back more of his findings. So as we can sort of see, though Meeken may present Wilhelm as sometimes being a bit fleeting with his interest, once he meets von Oppenheim, he starts to take, I think, the endeavour a lot more seriously. And ultimately, with this relationship, von Oppenheim starts to, I think, become a bit more inflated of his own importance, seeing himself as the Kaiser's personal envoy. And between 1896 and 1909, he files no less than 467 reports on Middle Eastern politics, and many of them over 100 pages or more. He emphasizes to Wilhelm the need to support pan-Islamism and sees the Ottoman government as the best power to suit German interests. And he's very condemnatory of some of the minority groups like the Armenians or other Christians, and viewing them as anti-Ottoman, therefore anti-German, and potential agents of the British. Obviously, all these activities catch the ire of the British in Egypt, notably Consul General Cromer, quite understandably, because Oppenheim starts palling around with radical Egyptian nationalists. And obviously, tensions were especially high during the Aqaba crisis in 1906, when there's a proposed expansion of the Hejaz Railway to Aqaba in modern Jordan, which led to a border conflict between the British and Ottoman forces. Von Oppenheim even pushes for a war, as he believed this would lead to a Muslim uprising in the British Empire. However, the German Foreign Office show restraint, but then from that point, he doesn't give up being radical. He then tries to take over a radical newspaper in 1909, and the Foreign Office are forced to formally sack him from his post because he's too much of a liability. However, Wilhelm, still wants to patronize him, so grants him a position of minister resident at large. And it's at this point that this figure I've got here on the right, Kurt Prüfer, comes into the picture. So Prüfer was a young Orientalist scholar. He was a talented linguist and was employed at the Cairo consulate as a dragoman for translation and interpretation services in 1907, and later was made a formal Oriental secretary. So due to his skills, Oppenheim takes kind of Prüfer Andrews Ring as sort of his Orientalist protege. And there's then another controversy where there's a powerful position in Egypt of the Khedive Library and its director, which was a major source of Oriental research. So in 1911, the current director retires and they need a replacement. The Germans push for Prüfer to succeed to the directorship. However, this is blocked by Lord Kitchener, the Consul General, as Prüfer is seen as being inappropriate due to his connections to Oppenheim. But also, there's very real concerns because Prüfer previously was caught gun-running weapons over the border into Libya during the Italo-Turkish War a couple of years before. So what the British certainly don't want is these agent provocateurs of the Germans going around inciting Islamic jihad in their back door. So as you can see here, there is you've really got this contest. The Foreign Office obviously have their practical interest in the Ottoman Empire, but of course Wilhelm seems to keep indulging in these rather radical sort of Muslim sympathizers. I mean, is there anything you have to say to this at all? Or?
No, just to say that it serves the interests, especially if we're going to look at the way that Wilhelm carried himself. He very much believed in a dynastic conception of high politics. What I mean by that is that he was one of the last real monarchs that believed that the monarch should determine foreign policy completely. And so it's completely within his character to appeal above the heads of his bureaucrats and his official diplomatic channels to these agents provocateurs who are actively launching their own agendas in these various territories. So appealing to both sides of the formal and informal aspects of the diplomatic establishment. But as you've already stated, despite the fact that von Oppenheim would send for what was it, over a decade, the Kaiser a memorandum every week. That's not to assume that the Kaiser read his memorandum every week, I assume. And so it's useful again
So
for
it's once
someone.
a year, sorry.
Sorry, I thought you said 400 memorandum over 13 years, or maybe I
Oh,
misheard
no,
you.
I'm sorry. No, so these were reports to the Foreign Office. He was sending regularly, but the visit to the Kaiser was once a year.
No, I was talking about the memoranda. Um,
Oh, sorry.
so yes, that sort of it's sort of expected, therefore, that the Kaiser should entertain these various characters. And of course, it's equally incumbent upon the British to anticipate that you don't want these sort of German cultural attaches to occupy high positions within a governmental position, which you're far more aware of this than I, in the Khedivate of Egypt, which is formally, it's an independent government under an Ottoman designated viceroy who is also a hereditary ruler, which is the Khedive, but is also a British protectorate and has been at this point for over 30 years. So having an unstable element, Kitchener was completely right to want to phase out all of these actors. And of course, as was alluded to in the original passage that you read out, all of these powers are using the same means at their disposal. We can talk about Baron Max von Oppenheim, but by far the more famous, and you've already actually shown him in your accompaniment to Verdi's Requiem at the beginning, is Lawrence of Arabia. So, yes, the British were prepared to use whatever means at their disposal indirectly, because Lawrence of Arabia wasn't acting in any official capacity when he attacked Aqaba, the city that connected to Jordan, as you mentioned. So, yes, all of these powers are willing to use these same regular and irregular means to, as it turned out in the First World War, destroy each other. So it should not be surprising. And again, from a purely academic point of view, it will be interesting for the Kaiser to entertain someone like the ideas of Oppenheim, how to create some sort of uh, Kaiserreich sort of syncretism with these colourful ideas which are emanating out. But actually, again, my point about Lawrence of Arabia again undermines this whole romanticism associated with the caliphate, given the fact that the Hashemites and the Saudis could be so completely resolute in their opposition to the House of Osman, should show again how completely fractious the whole state of Islam in the Middle East is.
No, certainly that's a fair assessment. Again, ultimately, I think that's a consequence of the decline of the caliphate. You've got the breaking up of the Ummah being under one sort of universal empire. It's broken down into these smaller states. So from that point, I now want to look at some more practical concerns the Germans had towards the Ottomans, and namely that of the economy and the infrastructure, namely the Berlin-Baghdad Express, the sort of main sort of project the Germans invested into the empire. So ultimately, the Germans end up being the main backer of this project because, though obviously, as you mentioned, the British and the French had their own interest in the Ottoman Empire. By this point, they had certainly alienated themselves. So obviously, after the Congress of Berlin, we take Cyprus off the Ottomans, which Abdulhamid didn't appreciate, but not much he could have done about. The French established their own protectorate over Tunisia in 1881. Then, of course, you've got the British occupation of Egypt in 1882. And then, of course, the French signed their Franco-Russian Treaty in 1894. And so the Germans seemed the best place to maintain a strategic relationship, which the Ottomans don't feel compromised by. So they formally agree the strategic partnership in the same year that Wilhelm makes his Jerusalem and Damascus visit in 1898. So the Ottomans grant the Germans this concession whereby they have the right to build a railway to Baghdad and the right to excavate any coal or minerals along the way. But in return, the Germans have to grant and provide intelligence on any anti-Ottoman revolutionary groups in the area.
Just an interesting point, because this sort of turns the traditional argument on its head. And this is something that's occurred to me before. Could you say that the Russians, the French, and the British were the instigators in expansionism in this region? And contrary to what we view about the Kaiser being this, you've already mentioned it, this great exponent of Weltmacht, or the Weltreich, the world empire, would it be actually more sensible to say that the Kaiser was actually trying to stabilize a situation in the Middle East from preventing these expansionist overtures by these other powers?
No, I think that's certainly an interesting interpretation. But again, it goes back to that passage from earlier. Wilhelm's trying to present himself as this, benevolent protector and friend of the Orient against these, bullying Western great powers. And you could even say this idea of indulging in Islamic jihad. It's like a great revenge on the Europeans, if you think about it.
Well, I would say that's a contradiction, and that's why there isn't a straightforward. There's never been a straightforward view in how to deal with the Kaiser. He can appeal to international relations on the one hand, and the other hand, he'll be talking about the overthrow of European empires based on appealing to Islam. He'll invite the Tsar to Bjorko and conclude a treaty of alliance, only to eventually declare war on him 10 years down the line. He will declare that Britain is the natural ally, and then he will, in the Daily Telegraph affair, declare that Britain is mad as March hares. And of course, earlier, I think you've already alluded to the fact that he was faintly supportive of the Transvaal Republic in the Second Boer War. You could look at Morocco as this again possibility of trying to prevent a war by breaking up the Entente and keeping Britain on side, but in fact it engenders more hostility. So all of these things you can read simultaneously, which is why the Kaiser is one of these very difficult historical personalities to read and appraise. And I think because of that, he's been chronically misappraised.
No, I think that's fair. And another point I'm just thinking of, would it perhaps not be fair to say, obviously you're talking about the British, French, and Russians all expanding at the expense of the Ottomans. It's like, despite obviously, the Germans are self-interested in this relationship with the Ottomans, at least the Germans aren't, demanding Ottoman territory for their help.
I think that's probably a short-term view, because as we all know, and you've already alluded to it, even the Italians began carving out Ottoman territory in Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. So the Germans have the distinction, I believe, of being one of the very few powers that doesn't grab a piece of German land. Yet at the same time, during the First World War, we had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divvies up Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq into French and British zones of influence. I think if the Kaiser had the opportunity, he would have been very desirous of a German concession in Basra in order to secure essentially that link with the Eastern colonies and the oil industry as well. So maybe had the trajectory of the Kaiserreich gone on longer, we could have begun to see some sort of territorial concession. But as it stands, as of, I believe, sort of 1914, yes, Germany does hold that remarkable distinction, even compared to the Italians.
No, and one other point I'm thinking of, I mean, let's imagine the Ottoman offensive in 1914 against Egypt succeeds, and the Ottomans successfully reconquer Egypt. I can imagine the Germans would probably demand control of the Suez Canal. I imagine in that situation.
At a minimum, yes.
Right. So just to carry on about the Berlin-Baghdad Express, there was actually another little reading I wanted to do from Mekin. So just going to get that. Okay. German interests in Ottoman rail were already in full swing when the Kaiser began his courtship of Abdul Hamid. It was a German engineer, Wilhelm von Pressel, who had designed and helped build the first leg of what would become the Baghdad Railway, the 60-mile line stretching from Istanbul's Asian shore along the Sea of Marmara inland to Izmit, completed in 1872. Pressel, sometimes called the father of the Baghdad Railway, grew fond during the years in the Anatolia of both Turkey and Turks, believing that the planned railway would reinvigorate the beleaguered Ottoman Empire and allow its people to seize control of its own destiny. It is noteworthy that the arch-imperial Orientalist Bismarck took personal note of Pressel's advocacy of the Ottoman cause, denouncing him as a simple Swabian engineer who dares tell me what to do. If Pressel's vision inspired the creation of the Baghdad Railway, however, it was not Pressel who would build it. The proposed line to Basra, covering 2,000 miles of arid and largely inhospitable steppe land, mountains, deserts, and swamps, was such an immensely costly undertaking that serious financial backing was necessary, not least because of Ottoman Turkey had declared bankruptcy in 1875. Its finance is now under strict European oversight. Pressel himself was too stubborn and idealistic to get on with the German moneymen who began descending on Constantinople in the 1880s and 1890s. In particular, George von Siemens, director of Deutsche Bank, whose granting of an emergency loan of 30 million marks to the Sultan in 1888 put Germany in the driver's seat for the Baghdad concession. Whereas Pressel wanted to internationalize the Baghdad project as broadly as possible, so as to cushion the Ottoman Empire against imperial encroachment by Germany, Siemens was a staunch imperialist who put German interests first. In this, Siemens was seconded by Baron Marshal von Bieberstein, Germany's State Secretary, and from 1897 ambassador to the Porte. In order to supplant French and British influence in Turkey and the Near East, the Baghdad Railway, Marshal declared emphatically in 1899, must be constructed with only German materials and for the purpose of bringing goods and people via the most direct path from the heart of Germany. This was much easier said than done. The Deutsche Bank-owned Anatolian Railway Company, chartered in 1889 on the heels of Siemens' generous loan to Abdul Hamid the previous year, did complete the extension of the Izmit line to Ankara by 1892 on its own, but even this comparatively modest project, covering only 250 miles, including a southern detour via Eskişehir, had required £1 million sterling laid down by British bankers to get off the ground. A rail line to Baghdad and Basra would likely require outlays of hundreds of millions, which would necessitate kilometric revenue guarantees to reinsure investors, because such revenue could only be processed via the French-dominated Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This meant French interests too had to be taken into account. Even setting aside Pressel's moral case against German domination of the Baghdad Railway, there was very good reasons for internationalizing the financing. Had the Germans succeeded in raising enough revenue on their own to begin construction, an unlikely prospect, this would only have excited French, British, and Russian suspicions. The more German the Baghdad Railway appeared, the more cause Paris, London, and St. Petersburg would have for trying to sabotage it, or for putting up rival bids for the concession. By contrast, if the Anatolian Railway Company sold shares broadly to French and British interests, it would cushion the financial risk faced by Deutsche Bank and increase the likelihood that the great powers would approve the Baghdad concession. The essential thing was camouflage. Germany must not appear to be building the railway alone, while somehow still securing the strategic benefit. Despite the political difficulties, the Germans had a major advantage in the bidding for the Baghdad concession: the Sultan's personal backing, the proliferating capitulations which allowed Europeans to run the Ottoman Empire's finances, postal services, and transport, made Abdul Hamid something of a guest in his own house. But he was still the nominal sovereign of his empire, and only the sovereign could sign off on the Baghdad concession. After all, selling the right to build this 2,000-mile railway and to raise the huge customs, ticket, and mining concession revenues needed to pay off its sure-to-be colossal construction debts was akin to mortgaging the financial future of Ottoman Turkey. As long as the suspicious Sultan lived, he would never mortgage his empire to the British, who had already taken Egypt, one of the crown jewels of his empire. Nor did he trust the French, who was already occupying the Ottoman provinces in the Maghreb and making imperial inroads in Syria, not to mention the intriguing opening with Russia, Turkey's mortal enemy. If any Europeans would build the new strategic artery of Asiatic Turkey, it would be the Germans or no one. The Kaiser's visit to Constantinople in 1898 raised the stakes in the game, but did not really alter the fundamentals. The Germans wanted to build an Ottoman railway stretching all the way to the Persian Gulf, with German steel and skilled labour, not only to take on all the financial risk. The Sultan wanted the Germans to build the Baghdad-Basra line, but only to his own specifications, as far as possible from Germany's vulnerable Mediterranean coastline, and passing through the volatile Armenian regions of eastern Anatolia to speed up troop deployments there, whether to meet an Armenian rebellion or a Russian invasion. The British wanted a railway of some kind, but one that would link the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf to stimulate trade. The French, for their part, would have preferred to expand their own Ottoman railway inland from Smyrna, or to build up a serious network stretching into Lebanon and Syria. The Russians wanted to derail or at least complicate all of these building projects except for the regional French lines. It was impossible, of course, to reconcile all these interests, but the German negotiators did their best. Despite the Sultan's strong preference for a Baghdad line routed eastward through Ankara from Sivas and Diyarbakir, which would avoid the coastline but might wind suspiciously close to the Caucasus, the Germans jettisoned this plan in favour of a more westerly line departing from the existing Anatolian Company railhead at Eskişehir, southeast of Konya, reached in 1896. Karaman, Eregli, and Bulgurlu, ostensibly undertaken to alleviate Russian concerns, this rerouting, in fact, made good economic sense, as the new route covered flatter ground and crossed more populated areas. It did, however, bring the German line into West Anatolian territory eyed hungrily by the French-owned Smyrna-Kasaba Rail Company, still building lines inland from the Aegean. Avoiding one potential landmine, the German planners nearly stepped on one another. To win over the acquiescence of the Smyrna-Kasaba Company, the Germans promised in May 1899 that French bankers would receive at least 40% of the capital stock floated by the Baghdad rail undertaking, and that 2 Smyrna-Kasaba representatives would sit on its board of directors. Meanwhile, the British group, funded by an Austrian banker named Ernest Recknitzer, was proposing to build a rail link from the Turkish port of Alexandretta, today Iskenderun, direct to Basra. This plan had the obvious advantage of being inexpensive, avoiding the Taurus and Amanus mountain ranges between Anatolia and Syria, and thus in theory making unnecessary the imposing kilometric guarantees by which the Sultan would be asked to pledge future tax revenues to railway bondholders. By speeding up the transport of goods from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean and beyond, the Recknitzner line had fantastic economic potential. Its disadvantage, of course, was that Recknitzer's backers were British. The Sultan's position, no less the Germans, was delicate. Financially, he may have been better off going with Recknitzer's consortium, which was offering to lay down initial construction costs all by itself, but a railway which failed to link Constantinople with eastern Anatolia and the Arab Near East would defeat the strategic point for the Sultan. The Germans on Siemens' negotiating team, but if they were to build the Baghdad railway, he knew they would probably have to raise British and French capital.
Sorry, you're cutting out a bit.
European encroachment on the Sultan's sovereign authority. Trusting no one entirely, the Sultan wished to reserve final control over the railway's routing and construction for himself. Oh, something you want to say there?
No, I was just saying you're cutting out a bit for me.
Oh, sorry. I'll just... So ultimately, that last bit was just Abdul Hamid was getting suspicious with all the foreign financing and involvement in the railway, that he's fine if it's a German endeavour, but bringing in the British and the French as well, it's like, it's almost like you foreigners just keep mortgaging off my empire from under me.
Yeah, and the same thing, I think someone's already, Rong Tao Wu has already alluded to it in the chat, that the exact same thing was going on with China, which, as you know, the Kaiser also decisively intervened, and that's where we get the famous Boxer Rebellion Hun speech from, which was another situation of how to deal with this vast ancient empire and these foreign powers competing over it. And, Si Chi is quite similar to Abdul Hamid in the same way that they both have a notorious and violent reputation. They both want to hold on to an aspect of sovereignty. In the case of Abdul Hamid II, it was choosing the lesser of all the evils and pitting the Germans off against the rest of the great powers was his desperate way of appealing to some form of sovereignty.
No, certainly, and it's just to make an interesting comparison. As you know, I'm doing a series on modern Iran, and I've recently been reading a lot about the Qajar period in the 19th century, and just to sort of compare a similar situation. I mean, compared to, you may argue the Ottomans were somewhat a bit underdeveloped in terms of their industry and infrastructure compared to the West, but compared to Iran, the Ottomans at least got something, because the only railway in Iran prior to Pahlavis coming in was one railway between Tehran and a local shrine, because the British and Russians, because they were the only two powers who had a stake in Iran, just kept vetoing each other, Whereas in the Ottomans, where you've got so many more powers involved, I think Abdul Hamid was able to balance off these different interests against each other.
And the irony, of course, of all of that is that that would actually seriously inhibit the ability of the Russians and the British to use Iran as a front against the Ottomans. So it worked ultimately to their detriment in the end. But yes, the Ottomans were, especially in the Levant and further west, comparatively far more developed than Iran.
No, certainly. Yeah, so just to also clarify some further points about the railway. So ultimately, by building all this infrastructure, as was alluded to, it allows Abdul Hamid to redeploy his troops if there's any sort of local uprisings, especially the Armenians. And so in terms of the actual concession, it is granted in 1898. So the Germans have to make a initial deposit of 200,000 Turkish lira to kickstart the construction, and they pledged to construct it within 8 years, but it would certainly take longer than that due to several difficulties. So Abdul Hamid, obviously always conscious of his sovereignty, puts in the clause where the Turks have the right to buy out sections of the line, which the Germans grant, but ultimately it's moot because considering the empire's finances are controlled by the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, it's not like he ever feasibly could have done so. But I just think it was a point of pride more than anything. So the Germans also agreed to build telegraph lines along the railway, as well as military installations, and also they allow the Turks the right to use the railway for usage during wartime, understandably, because as you just said there with Persia, the railway infrastructure helps the Ottomans reinforce their various fronts, whether with Iran or the British. In terms of dealing with the sort of geographic
perhaps it would just be illustrative for people listening is that the Ottoman Empire is completely surrounded. The only area where it ends up not having a front is with Bulgaria, and that wasn't really the case until 1913 when the Bulgarians began gravitating towards the Central Powers, because even they had been at war with Bulgaria only a year before. So the Ottoman situation is, I think, dire is an understatement, because when we're talking about it being enveloped by all of these foreign powers, we even have to talk about the Italian front in Antalya and the Dodecanese as well, the British in Kuwait. So yes, you can understand, therefore, even under all those circumstances, the desperation to appeal to some sort of outlet away from that.
No, certainly. Yes, in terms of just addressing some of the logistical and geographic problems. So obviously the Taurus, the railway construction was fine, going from the Straits up to sort of modern the sort of Kilikia region, but unfortunately due to the Taurus Mountains, that was a particularly obstructive obstacle the Germans had to deal with, and so the construction grinds to a halt in 1905 as they end up running out of money as well. What's also interesting is further to the south, the Germans do help build another railway, a Damascus to Medina. That part of the reason is that was actually funded by the Muslim subjects of the empire subscribing to this project. So the subjects were putting forward their own money to raise 75 million francs to fund this, and also linking it back to the sort of Abdul Hamid's sort of leaning more into his role as caliph, and that made it easier for his subjects to complete the Hajj to Mecca. So there was that as well, and obviously the Germans then keep investing more funds to keep progressing it. But as you see on this map, the red lines are the completed sections of rail. The pink lines are planned, and so you can see that though they are eventually able to get through the Taurus and through Syria down to the Levant and then east towards Mesopotamia, you see that it does stop in northern Iraq, and then you've got a large gap until you get to central Iraq that then goes through Baghdad before not again another gap before you have one to Basra. So they didn't quite complete that during the period that we're discussing, to the Germans and Ottomans a detriment. And just before I move on, I just want to address a comment from Rongtao Wu. I think after this stream, I have to agree more and more with Iron Duke on the Kaiser being borderline retarded. Though I've shown criticism to him as well as McMeekin in the book, I don't think it's fair to call Wilhelm retarded.
No, I don't think that's fair at all. I think over time, I actually see him as unlucky, less than suffering from a lack of intelligence. I mean, the issue we have, especially in this country, talking about England, is we are all taught to view the Kaiser's policies as a series of deliberate provocations. And if you look at it from the Kaiserreich point of view, it's essentially the opposite intention. Hence why I said that the whole issue with the Kaiser is to look at it as a vast series of misunderstandings and misappraisals. Yes, it's undoubtedly a failure of diplomacy, because the whole point of diplomacy is it doesn't really matter what your intention is, only how your intention is perceived. So, no, I don't think it's fair to see the Kaiser as being an idiot in this regard, because it should also be noted, I think, regarding the caliphate idea. This whole European fascination and idealization of Islam, and you already talked about the long history, and you talked elsewhere in your channel, Bede, about the long history of Orientalism. I talked recently about Talleyrand, 100 years before, and how he embraced Napoleon's Orientalism. Of course, Benjamin Disraeli was a great Orientalist as well. So was Walter Scott. You can look to all of these various figures, and they have the same fascination, but also perhaps misconception is the most polite way of saying it. And this would go further beyond this period to figures like Louis Massignon and the rather sort of bizarre influence he had on the Catholic Church in presenting Islam in its most reconcilable but perhaps most inaccurate light. So no, the Kaiser is simply endemic of a trend within sort of a European sort of intellectual sort of conceptions or misconceptions of the Near East. And Bede and I can talk about how the caliphate idea, especially with hindsight, was completely historically incongruous, and it relied on a huge amount of idealism, which didn't pertain at all to the history or the conception of realpolitik. So no, it's not fair to look at him as retarded. I also, just on your follow-up questions, because I'm reading your comments, I don't believe he was actually that particular of a gambler either. I don't believe Morocco or Agadir was that great of a gamble in the grand scheme, nor do I think I don't believe the Berlin-Baghdad railway was that much of a gamble. I'm sorry, I cut out. How much did you get of me?
Oh, pretty much most of it. I think it was like only one word you cut out for.
Well, yeah, again, just to say that as Bede has already been referring to, the Berlin-Baghdad railway was taken under advisement and with concessions towards the other powers. How can you really see that as a big gamble? I mean, when Vittorio Emanuele III invaded Libya and the Dodecanese, it came with the associations of basically torpedoing his alliance with the Austrians and the Germans, and really down the road it did. So many other European rulers were taking far more greater gambles. I mean, Gladstone is often looked at as this greater, peacemaker, and he looked at the British Empire as this unnecessary encumbrance, yet he was also responsible for creating a protectorate in Egypt and Sudan. So I think the more you contextualize the actions of the Kaiser in German foreign policy, and the more that you disabuse yourself of all of the errors in our understanding leading up to the causes of World War I, the easier it is to reappraise a figure like the Kaiser. This is also why, Bede, I'm of the opinion that the causes of World War I should not be taught in schools, because it only leads people with the wrong impression. It's probably one of the most deleterious things you can do in terms of teaching, because it's virtually all misinformation. And I don't mean that with its monoconnotations, I mean genuine misinformation.
No, I've heard you echo that elsewhere, and I agree with you. My sort of view is I just think the whole thing is so complex, you can't really adequately explain it to school children. And would you say that's a fair assessment, or do you think I'm being too harsh on school children? Is it more that it's just badly taught?
I think it's badly taught. Quite frankly, because you can teach school children about the context, but the problem is history to some extent relies on narratives. And whenever a teacher is trying to form a narrative for a student, I mean, I've seen history textbooks which are being taught where they don't even draw maps of Europe. They just show the countries in Europe as blobs. That's how
Oh
aggressively
no.
that's how aggressively oversimplified the topic is. No, it should be completely banned because even within undergraduate and postgraduate education, it's still really contentious a subject. So no, avoid like the plague.
Perhaps if there's ever a sensible, proper British government, when we'll have Minister of Education, Apostolic Majesty, will put to rights the dire state of British education.
We'll see. Maybe my last sort of dying wish in sort of 70 years' time, we'll find out.
Certainly. And just when I've come from wrong tobu, but also this view of Islam is in itself kind of brain scratching. The Kaiser himself for sure was not unintelligent. Well, this is actually another point that's come to my mind, and I want your view on this. I have to wonder whether all this sort of Islam simping, if you want to call it that, is it not just like a kind of lip service where Wilhelm knows what Abdul Hamid's views are and what he's trying to do, and he simply just wants to say the right things to be diplomatic and win him over? Would you say that's fair?
I think this is all part of a context of reconciling Muslim subjects to imperial superstructures, imperial European superstructures. The French, as you've already alluded to, would gain Morocco during this time and the Maghreb. The British had India, and the position of Emperor of India was essentially created as a translatio imperii, a follow-on of imperial power from the Mughals, who were Muslim emperors. So all over the world, these European empires were integrating Muslim hierarchies and Muslim subjects. I mean, in terms of like the Indians, you had Saeed and His Majesty's most loyal Mohammedans. So yes, I think there was a huge amount of pragmatism and cynicism that went into these associations and appealing to these idealistic connections to the history of Islam. Of course, went hand in hand. But you've also alluded to people who go rogue, and of course that happened as well. There's a thin line between sort of inspiration and madness in this case. So it's a very interesting question, and I think it involves appealing to all sides without compromising your sort of fundamental worldview. In the case of India, for example, there was never a coronation for the emperors of India for that exact reason. Any coronation would seem to be creating a religious establishment for India, and so instead they opted for a simple durbar, which is a confirmation of all the vassals, all the Indian princelings accepting the British king emperor as their sovereign. So yes, this was an issue which all the European rulers had to grapple with. And funny enough, this was something that the Kaiser didn't really have to concern himself to a great degree, because his empire relatively was so small. I mean, you can talk about the enduring presence of Muslims in German East Africa. You can talk about some Muslims in Cameroon, I think, a couple. But perhaps the most prominent Muslim side of the German Empire, Zanzibar, was actually given over to the British in exchange for Heligoland. So there we are.
Oh no, certainly. Thank you for that elaboration. So what I would like to do now is, so obviously Abdul Hamid is overthrown during the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, and obviously with the loss of this personal connection between the sovereigns, Abdul Hamid and Wilhelm, this does seem to put this sort of a project of interest in the Ottomans in somewhat jeopardy. And I think it's worth looking at the Young Turks sort of prior to the revolution.
Just before we get to that, do you think it bears mentioning the significance of the port of entry You've already mentioned Smyrna, you've already mentioned Constantinople. Um, because Berlin to Baghdad is actually, by that way, a bit of a misconception, isn't it? Because we're talking about the Oriental Express, but the Oriental Express goes through countries which aren't necessarily um, friendly towards the Germans during this time. We can talk about World War One, and the Germans needed to create the Central Powers, but even among the Central Powers, Romania switched sides, and the Serbs are expanding into this region at the same time. So it's not just getting a link to Baghdad and Basra and filling in that line to Mosul. It's just also the point of access, because the Germans had virtually no presence in the Mediterranean. So at any point along the west, essentially this link of what could essentially be translated into military infrastructure could be broken.
No, that's certainly a fair point. And from the reading I've done, when it comes to the Ottoman Empire, it seems to me that Wilhelm and the Germans, they seem more interested in the Asiatic part of the Ottoman Empire, because when it comes to the Balkan Wars, Wilhelm does actually jeopardize the relationship by, siding with the Greeks over their claims on Albania. And so that seems to be one element of it. He's thinking, well, I don't care about the European part of the empire as long as this great sort of Oriental railroad that's enough for me.
But just because I think the ports are a major angle which get overlooked, because you can look at this project as doomed to fail because it fails to link up with these sort of German-friendly ports. I mean, my contention has always been, if there was any grand strategy of the Wilhelmine Empire, Weltpolitik, world politics, it would have had to rely on the Basra connection, which of course was never achieved during the time of the Wilhelmine Empire. And I've already alluded to the fact that the French placed a very heavy investment in the port of Beirut, which of course was completely conducive with their goals. The British, of course, invested, and the French invested very heavily in the Suez Canal. And as far as I'm aware, I could be misunderstanding the situation, but going off memory, there was a huge international investment in the port in Smyrna, to the point that it's been described as a melting pot, quote unquote. So, to me, this is just an angle that seems to get overlooked in terms of the necessity of integrating the naval aspects with the on land infrastructure. And this is a point where the navy is a key to understanding the Kaiser's vision of his empire. The Kaiser is following the Tirpitz strategy. We have the succession of naval laws, I think, from 1897 onwards. And the Kaiser manages to construct, in the space of about 15 years, the world's second largest navy using modern dreadnought ships after 1906. And yet, these are all sort of bottled up in the North Sea. If the Kaiser is going to build up this potential empire in the Orient by proxy, I mean, this is the reason why I think my sort of earlier illusion or joke about the German Manchukuo is kind of ludicrous as a comparison, because the whole point of Manchukuo for the Japanese is that it was so logistically and economically integrated with Japan proper, despite being a nominally independent country under an emperor. And so this whole superstructure would have to rely on something like the Italians. And as we know, the Germans have basically given up on the Italians as a serious ally by 1911.
Well, one thing I would say is I think it also explains why Wilhelm was interested in trying to bring the Bulgarians on board, because the Bulgarians could help, bridge the gap between Austria, Hungary, and the Ottomans to try and get this link. But regarding the naval aspect, well, as we know, in the early months, one of the key events that precipitates the Ottoman involvement in the war is the chase of the Gerben and the Breslau, the two German ships, through the Adriatic into Constantinople. And now I know it's only two ships, but that was significant firepower that when the Germans gifted it to the Turks, that it significantly bolstered the strength of the Ottoman fleet, which allowed them to, seriously threaten the Russian position in the Black Sea. So ultimately, yes, it's not the whole of the the High Seas fleet, but gifting ships in this way at least helped give the Ottomans stronger sort of, I guess, naval access and control. So does that not really mean anything, or do you still think it's insufficient?
No, it does. It does mean something. I'm not saying the Ottoman naval power was insignificant. In fact, as far as I'm aware, in the 70s, even before Abdul Hamid became Sultan, there was a major shipbuilding enterprise because the Ottomans have been historically a great naval power in the Mediterranean. But I'm simply talking about the scale and the logistics needed. I mean, as you know, with the campaigns of von Lettow-Vorbeck, the actual consequence of the whole design of the German high seas fleet, concentrated as it was in Wilhelmshaven, meant that the only wartime role that the German East African army could feasibly achieve was just tying down vast numbers of Allied troops and keeping them away from the Western Front. The Germans had to rely on increasingly imaginative tactics in order to even access their colonies, such as Zeppelin transportation. So no, I just think that this speaks to a fundamental fragility for the whole situation, because you mentioned the whole the Black Sea situation being relatively advantageous towards the Russians, where the Russians navally were the much weaker power, especially after the Russo-Japanese War and the Battle of Tsushima. They couldn't really do anything to prevent the embankments on Gallipoli, for example. So yes, they were successful in one sphere against the weaker ally, but not so successful in terms of the naval sphere, in terms of projecting power outwards decisively into the Aegean, which I think the Germans would have had to reconcile to their overall. If you're going to say that there is a straightforward expansionist objective, that would have to be key, establishing some sort of counterweight in the Aegean and indeed in the Levant, because of the French connection there and the British connection. So the more you sort of get into the nitty gritty of the logistics and the placement of German military encampments, so to speak, the more the whole imperial project becomes apparent as what it was, which is just Bismarck gaining concessions from the scramble of Africa before the Kaiser even becomes the ruler of Germany. And because of that, because these are diplomatic concessions and not the process of a conscious sort of desire, innate desire of Bismarck to build a great Middle African empire, or an empire in the East, it unravels very quickly. And it's also part of the reason as to why, when the National Socialists come to power in the 1930s, Hitler is only willing to entertain the possibility of the restoration of Germany's former colonies very, very half-heartedly, just as a bone to throw to the German monarchists who have that association with the empire, thanks to figures like Lettow von Vorbeck.
No, certainly. Thank you for that. So, just to move on.
Do you agree with any of that?
Oh no, I do agree with you. Yeah, and I think in the mid-century Germans' case, I certainly think their prospect of a German empire was much more feasible, considering it was in one consolidated block and not spread out over these various colonies.
The whole sort of basis of German power really does seem to rely. Again, this is why the funny thing is, the whole notion of the peace Kaiser is actually, it's not some sort of post hoc apologetics for him. It was derisive. It was used by the critics of the Lebensburg Round Table and figures like Holstein, who believed that the Kaiser was just a pacifist in this regard. Because the more you sort of look into it, the more you realize that the economic logic of the world empire relied on you can say, a rather naive phrase uttered by the Kaiser, I think, around the time of the Morocco crisis, which is the Weltreich, the world empire of Germany, endeavors to be the most honest and trustworthy friend to the world. So really, the whole basis of German expansionism is actually dependent on the peace of Europe, as contradictory as that would seem.
No, certainly. I mean, despite best intentions, if you're an upstart imperial power, the other imperial powers are going to resent and try and stop you from gaining any more power or territory.
The French were able to carry relatively sort of unfilled by the time that the 1830s come on. So the French were able to take away the bits that the British weren't able to get their hands on. So we're talking about West Africa and we're talking about Indochina. The Russians, of course, they already had an empire, just a different form of empire from the British. They had this vast, continuous empire which stretched to the borders of Afghanistan, China, and Iran and the Caucasus, as you and I have talked about before. But in the case of Germany, Bismarck was correct in assuming that the whole basis of German power was on the continent, and any sort of expansion elsewhere would necessarily complicate that view. So the Kaiser, again, was trying to find very, you can say, creative means of trying to rebalance that situation. But because Germany was ultimately a latecomer in the race for empire, along with countries like Italy, their progress towards empire is somewhat stunted. In the case of the Italians, their intrigues in empire are even more pathetic than the Germans. They attempt to establish a protectorate over Abyssinia, and they are defeated by the forces of Emperor Menelik. You can say, oh yes, they conquer Libya from the Turks, but Libya is just a desert, effectively. The Italians wanted Tunisia, and even the French took Tunisia in lieu of the Italians. So the Germans have to suffer from the fact that, due to the lateness of the integration of the German Reich in the 1870s, they have to suffer this imbalance compared to their habitual enemy, the Third Republic of France.
And then just to add to the Italian point, I mean, you could even make the argument that with the Italians, they didn't even conquer all of Libya. Yes, they took the coast, but then they still had to deal with the Senussi order in the Sahara Desert, which bogged them down for many years. So it was complete headache in the long run.
I mean, the borders were never really even confirmed properly because of that. I mean, even by the time of like late Mussolini in the 1930s, they were still having to deal with that problem. Which is why you have Italo Balbo coming in and trying to confirm some sort of stability in the colony as well. And this is before we even have a serious prospect for Libyan oil. So, yeah.
No, certainly. Okay, so yes, want to move on to the sort of Germans' relations with the Young Turks, because so I just want to sort of look at the Young Turks sort of in this period in the 1890s when they're in exile, because sort of interesting relationship, because obviously because they are opposition, opposition to Abdul Hamid. Obviously, he sees them as his enemy, and the Germans start sort of spying on them for Abdul Hamid. And what makes them really a credible threat is in hang on, sorry, in 1899, an Ottoman prince, Damad Mahmud Pasha, and his sons Sabahaddin and Lutfullah, they leave and defect to the Young Turks. So the Young Turks have gone from being this sort of, dissident political movement in exile to potential pretender movement for the Ottoman throne, considering the involvement of these princes. And what sort of complicates this even more is that these Ottoman princes have their own views as to what Western powers they think the Ottoman Empire should be working with. I mean, Sabahaddin and his father are both very much pro-British, and one of the first things they do when they're in exile is they try to appeal to the British to support the Young Turk movement, but they understand we get no reply because the British don't want anything to do with this. And what's also interesting is they also try and appeal to Wilhelm directly to pressure Abdul Hamid to restore the 1876 constitution, but Wilhelm ignores them as well. And yes, I mentioned about the sort of various spying and intelligence, and there's just
sorry. Could you repeat which constitution was that?
The 1876 constitution, the one that Abdul Hamid.
Just for confirmation, that was the confirmation that was based on something called Tanzimat, which was on effectively reforming the Ottoman Empire to integrate its ethnic minorities more based on a constitutional form of government and a parliamentary system of government, which is what some of the Young Turks were attached to. So this was before the self-coup of Abdullah Hamid II 2 years later, because it's an important point to note, because this was seen as the great betrayal in Turkish politics from the point of view of the sort of more invested sort of political elites who believed that they had a right to share in the power that the Sultan had basically usurped from them in terms of their anticipation.
Oh no, certainly. Thank you for providing that context. So, okay. So the Damad Mahmud affair furnished a dry run of the international propaganda wars, which would increasingly poison great power politics in the new century. On the one side, there was a respectable opinion, mainly British and French inflected, which predictably lined up behind Mahmud and his sons. Yes, it is true that I fled from my country, the Sultan's brother-in-law told a sympathetic reporter from the Matin in January 1900, because the whole empire is a prison. Abdul Hamid keeps us all in a prison, from Sultan Murad V to the lowliest member of the ulama in Istanbul. Mahmud spoke even more freely to the London Standard, informing British sympathisers that the wicked despot of Constantinople had annihilated thousands of human beings, Muslims and Christians. The German press, by contrast, taking its cues from the Kaiser's pro-Hamidian Orient politic, smeared Mahmud at every opportunity. The Post suggested the Ottoman pretender was fronting for the Reknitsa group, embittered after losing out on the Baghdad railway concession. New Preußische Zeitung and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung dismissed Mahmud as an out-and-out English spy, or perhaps suggested De Bund with a sneer this wayward son of the Ottoman dynasty was blackmailing the Sultan in order to increase his allowance from 3 to 5 million Swiss francs. Long before the Anglo-French Entente Cordiale formalised the anti-German alliance in 1904, Europe's press barons had their parts in the drama down pat. When the diplomats and spies threw their hats in the ring, the international rout over the Young Turks grew nastier still. Even before Mahmud and his sons had left Constantinople, the German government had been spreading rumours about assassination plots being hatched in Europe against Abdul Hamid. Geneva, then as today an international playground of rich and well-connected exiles, was second only to Paris as a Young Turk refuge. Ahmad Mahmud himself had yet set up shop there, injecting a great deal of his fortune into Young Turk propaganda, because so much CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, a faction of the Young Turks, literature smuggled into Constantinople was being printed in Geneva. German insinuations about conspiracies against the Sultan were potentially embarrassing to the Swiss authorities if anything did happen to Abdul Hamid. Quietly, the Swiss ambassador in Berlin assured German State Secretary Bülow that his government would do everything possible to ensure that no plots against the Sultan or his government could be organised from Geneva. With a characteristic mixture of boldness and blundering, the Germans seem to have taken this promise as a blanket invitation to crack down on Young Turk plotters in Switzerland. Not long after Mahmud and his sons fled Constantinople in the winter of 1899 to 1900, Philipp von Richthofen, a shadowy associate of Baron Oppenheim, surfeited in Geneva. Curiously, Richthofen signed his own correspondence as the Consul General of the Ottoman Empire for Switzerland, despite his rather obvious Germanic name and title. And despite the fact there were already another Ottoman consul in Switzerland, Richthofen was almost certainly working for German intelligence, which furnished him with extremely detailed reports on the movements of the Young Turk agitators in Europe. In his guise as Ottoman consul in Geneva, Richthofen forwarded these reports onto Munir Bey, Abdul Hamid's ambassador in Paris, until, that is, Richthofen was outed as an impostor by the Swiss police, to the delight of the Young Turks and their supporters in the Western press. In defence of the Germans, it must be said that many CUP leaders were all but begging to be spied upon. It was not only Mahmud and his sons who wrote openly to the Kaiser about their plans to overthrow Abdul Hamid, so did the Young Turk activists like Ahmed Riza, who had addressed a passionate appeal to Wilhelm in November 1898. "You have already seen our beautiful country," Riza wrote to the Kaiser on the occasion of his visits to Jerusalem and Damascus, but asked him also to reflect on the sad condition of the Ottoman Empire. "Its ruins and misery. You must," Riza enjoined Wilhelm, "dare to listen to the people, hear their voices as once Moses and Muhammad heard the voice of God in these parts." With touching naivete, Riza continued sending copies of Mesveret to the German Foreign Office, hoping they might be passed on to the Kaiser so as to enlighten him about the true state of affairs under the despotic Sultan. Instead, the Wilhelmstrasse paid along Riza's missives against Abdul Hamid to Abdul Hamid. As the Young Turk movement in Europe gathered steam, German efforts to quash it grew more desperate. Spying for the Sultan took on a self-perpetuating quality. The more intelligent on CUP conspiracies reached Abdul Hamid's ears, the more terrified he became, which led him to demand yet more intelligence. Thus, in August of 1905, a single revolutionary pamphlet occasioned a full-blown investigation in which the Wilhelmstrasse enlisted the regular German police. The Sultan would be most grateful to the German imperial government, Marshal Deputy wrote from the embassy summer residence at Therapia, if the police authorities in Munich could inform him from which circles, workers, students, Young Turks, Armenians, Macedonians, the pamphlet could have originated, as well as which individuals and leaders it has reached. Goaded on by State Secretary Bülow, the Munich authorities duly complied. German surveillance of the Ottoman pretenders was even more thorough. Prince Sabahardin, who had replaced Ahmed Riza as the public face of the CUP organisation in Paris, sought an audience with Pope Pius X in March 1906. ostensibly on behalf of the official Ottoman heir apparent Mehmed Reshad, to discuss relations between the Vatican and the Porte and the prospects for reform, particularly related to the status of Catholic minorities in the Ottoman Empire. After long and tortuous negotiations over protocol, it was agreed that the Ottoman prince would be personally presented to the Pope by the Vatican Secretary of State, on the strict condition that no one learn of the meeting. If news leaked out, it could be embarrassing to the Vatican, which would appear to be interfering in Ottoman religious affairs. Even worse, however, with the damage done to Sabahardin's reputation among the Muslim faithful. If it seemed he was intriguing with the prelate of Rome, even the Young Turks might object to such brazen cynicism. Naturally, the German ambassador in Rome made sure to pass on everything he knew about Sabahardin's courting of the Pope to State Secretary Bülow, to be forwarded on to Abdul Hamid. The Sultan, in turn, seems to have leaked the Germans' intelligence on the Vatican meeting to his spies in the Young Turk movement. Before long, Prince Sabahardin was accused by rivals in the Paris CUP of taking money from the Pope. Like his father Mahmud and his rival Ahmed Riza, Sabahardin was an easy mark for the Germans. Despite numerous rebuffs, the Ottoman prince continued to seek an audience with the German emperor, as he did yet again after meeting the Pope. Not surprisingly, the German embassy in Rome declined his visa request on direct orders from the State Secretary Bülow in Berlin, in pursuing the named individual as a revolutionary dangerous to the state. Whereas many of Sabahardin's CUP and Armenian co-conspirators took pains to conceal their authorship of anti-Hamidian literature, the prince pretended to openly address these revolutionary screeds to European chancelleries, inviting them to intervene in the Ottoman Empire to promote minority rights. Sabahardin wore sedition on his sleeve. Succession controversies, of course, were nothing new in European politics. Still, there was something fundamentally different about the conspiracies against Abdul Hamid. Prince Sabahardin was not simply staking a claim to the disputed throne in the manner of European royal houses trying to one-up each other in territorial horse trading. He was setting himself up as a vehicle for reform in the Ottoman Empire and with it the entire Islamic world. As Sabahardin wrote to British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey from Paris in August 1906, Constantinople was still the seat of the Caliphate, with supreme authority over Sunni Islam. Thus, with the triumph of liberal ideas in Turkey, Sabahardin promised Grey, the great moral influence which Constantinople possesses over Islam at large is destined to assume an intellectual character. Such an influence would then serve as a powerful agent of reconciliation between East and West. Unlike Abdul Hamid, he and his Young Turk allies possessed an intellectual outlook which was quite up to date. They were ready to adopt the ideas of Western civilization. Music to the ears of Western liberals, Prince Sabahardin's vision of the modernising caliphate on Western lines was unlikely to inspire much of a following in the Muslim world. His letter to Grey was published just as the Aqaba conflict was reaching fever pitch, whipping up Islamic passions from Constantinople to Cairo, where Egyptian nationalists took up the Sultan's claim to the Sinai Peninsula. Confronting the spectre of pan-Islam veering dangerously close to the great imperial choke point at the Suez Canal, British diplomats were hardly going to back an Ottoman imperial pretender already notorious for his support of Christian minorities and reputed to be intriguing with the Pope. Indulging Prince Sabahardin's liberalism was a luxury the British could ill afford. So, ultimately, as we can see there, Sabahardin, despite his best efforts, was never going to get the British to really support him, because ultimately I think he was proving himself to be too much of a liability with the rest of the Ottoman establishment. Obviously, Riza's mentioned there a few times, and he's interesting. There are some what you might call sentimental reasons. He was reaching out to Wilhelm and was quite pro-German. He was actually half German himself. His mother was German. But what's also interesting is later, in terms of his connections, he always advocated for the Young Turks to work with the Germans as the best sort of Western partner of the Turks. But later on during the revolution, after Abdul Hamid tries to launch his counter coup on the 31st of March, where he gets his supporters to try and arrest or execute the Young Turk leadership, where does Ahmed Riza go and find refuge? It's with the Germans in the Baghdad Railway Company building. But in spite of that sort of those sentimental reasons, I think there's a more pragmatic reason. I think Riza is believing that if the Young Turks are going to come into power, the Turks already have a constructive relationship with the Germans, so it makes sense to carry on that relationship. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Just a note in the chat, Rong Tao Wu has actually anticipated a comparison which I was going to make, which is in the 1480s, there was a succession war within the second and his brother Cem. And Cem went ultimately to seek refuge under the popes. And I think he was murdered when Alexander VI became Pope a decade later. So a weird sort of historical connection there. But just to say, with the Young Turks, one of the most difficult things when encountering this period of history is to look at the Young Turks as any sort of cohesive group, because if they all wanted reform, they wanted to reform the empire in radically different ways. As you've already mentioned with Sabahaddin, the whole notion of Tanzimat and Ottomanism, kind of like what you see actually in terms of trying to mimic what the British were doing with the again, my brain is going at the moment. I can't quite remember the Chelmsford reforms. It might be before or after this period. But the British were beginning a gradual process of reform to integrate the overall imperial structure, the princelings, and a form of autonomy for India around about the time that the Earl of Minto was viceroy. So around this time, around
I
1905
think that was the
to
Morley-Minto
1911.
reforms, if I remember
Yes,
correctly.
the Minto reforms. I was correcting myself as the memory was flooding back to me. So, funnily enough, the Ottomanism would have actually sort of resembled the Minto reforms in the British Raj. So it seems only appropriate that someone like Prince Sabahaddin would appeal to Ottomanism and the British on those lines. Conversely, if we're going to the later the coup of the three pashas in 1913. The goal of Enver Pasha in particular is aggressive pan-Turkism and militarism. Now, you already anticipated there, which is completely at odds with Ottomanism. But again, you look to the central sort of tenets of Abdul Hamid's rule as Sultan, which was emphasis on the Caliph and the role of Islam. Pan-Turkism, ultimately, as it transpired, turned out to be very very hostile towards the Kurds. So it basically pursued, you can say, secular and ethnic goals, which, from the point of view of someone like Enver Pasha, involved directing Ottoman expansionism, not in terms of cementing the caliphal idea, but towards integrating the Azeris and the Caucasus, and ultimately the Turkmens in Central Asia from the Russians, where he would die in the service of the Emir of Bukhara, which rather sort of fortuitously I already mentioned. So the issue with the Young Turks is that they are intellectually diffuse and personally diffuse movement, pluralistic to its own detriment. And once it finally does take power, following the first deposition of Abdul Hamid II, it's done actually in opposition, I believe, to the creation of the Aromanian millet, which was essentially, you could say, the last-ditched attempt by Abdul Hamid II to create favorable partisans for him in Europe. The Young Turks come in. It precipitates in some way the Balkan Wars after the disastrous Italo-Turkish Wars, and they do absolutely disastrously, which discredits a huge number of Young Turks, but also discredits the possibility of the Ottomans being any sort of useful ally for anyone, potentially including the Germans within this whole situation. So yes, it's very difficult, as I'm trying to outline, to find any through line for the Young Turks because of their diffusion.
No, certainly. And just a comment from Rungtawu, Sabahaddin is half German. No, Ahmed Riza is half German. Sorry. No, Sabahaddin was an Ottoman prince. Well, unless I don't know, his father had like a German woman in his harem, which I find unlikely.
Well, for reference, the Ottoman dynasty were more Slavic ethnically than they were Turkish.
No, that's a fair point. There's certainly. Yeah, so in terms of obviously this leadership, so obviously the direct consequences of 1908 is not only obviously do you have this revolution, but there's a series of humiliations for the Ottomans in the Balkans. So obviously it's been 30 years since the Congress of Berlin, and so obviously the Austrians had been occupying Bosnia-Herzegovina, and obviously the time of that occupation was due to end. And what the Austrians decided to do, as you know, is they decided to announce their annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that was a humiliation for the Turks. But if anything, that was more of a the dispelling of an illusion, because I mean it was effectively an Austrian province anyway by that point. It was just made
Yes,
de facto de
the
jure. Sorry.
Austrians had occupied it since the original Congress of Berlin, so it was, for all intents and purposes, a shadow sort of an Austrian province. It's quite funny actually. There's an anecdote when the Kaiser was informed about this. He called Aehrenthal, the foreign minister of Austria, as having been guilty of a imbecilic prank with the annexation. And when Aehrenthal was basically informed that the Kaiser objected, why wasn't the Kaiser informed? And Aehrenthal sort of bluntly replies, "It's because I know you would have." Yeah, it's one of these last sort of gasps where Austria is trying to assert that it has any sort of independent autonomy as an empire. And as you've already alluded to, it was a de facto situation which the Austrians simply made de jure. And it upset everyone, perhaps unduly, given how insignificant the actual consequence of the annexation was. It was literally just a legal redesignation from occupied province to incorporated province. And it wasn't even really that incorporated into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because it remained its own separate thing as a co-dominion between the Austrian and Hungarian halves of the empire as well, under the control of the finance ministry. So all it did, if anything, was just to show that the disputes in the Ottoman Empire concerning all of the ethnic groups had really just been bubbling under the surface. And the great instigating effect was the 1902 regicide of the, if I recall, the Abrenović dynasty in Serbia, which went from pro-Austrian under the Karađorđević dynasty. It went very sort of pro-Russian, and this sort of upset the very delicate balance in the area, and you can say helped create the febrile climate that we see during the Balkan Wars and World War One.
And that certainly, and other than the Austrian annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, you also have the Bulgarians, which had been an Ottoman vassal formerly since the 1878, formally declare their independence.
Oh, it's the Bulgarian situation is incredibly complicated. You have northern Bulgaria, which is a autonomous protectorate under the Ottoman Sultan. They had a designation of prince, and later they would very ostentatiously, I think under Ferdinand, change the name of Bulgarian prince to Bulgarian Tsar. While the southern half of Bulgaria was an actual integrated province of, if I recall, the Ottoman province of Rumelia. So the Bulgarian situation was even more complicated than the Serb situation.
Certainly, and then the third humiliation is Crete, which had been like an autonomous government, formally declared they're going to merge and join Greece, which they're formally annexed in 1913. So you have this sort of trio of humiliations after the revolution. And obviously, I've alluded to earlier that Sabahardin, was very pro-British, but many other leading members of the Young Turks were actually pro-British as well. It was, the British were much more liked because the Young Turks saw them as like a model for what essentially the direction they wanted to take the empire in.
Can I ask a question regarding this? Because obviously you've been reading about this more recently than I have, but obviously the ideological link, and I've already explained as to why, because there was a similar situation going on within the British Empire. But how did the Anglo-Russian Persian Agreement of 1907 rejig the views of the Young Turks, if at all? Because the Ottomans, obviously, for 200 years at this point, had been fearful of becoming a Russian protectorate. And now the British were cozying up to Russia in a situation that really had been unprecedented since the Napoleonic Wars. So I wonder, did the English advocates within the Young Turk movements almost discredit themselves due to this kindling of the Triple Entente?
No, I would agree with you. I think that's fair. But another point I want to get to is I think what really confirmed this AM is that the Young Turks that are pro-British want to appeal to the British to, please come in and please go back to being our original sort of ally and protector against Russian aggression. And what's incredible is the British just aren't interested, because they view the Young Turks as, perhaps somewhat correctly, as this dangerous radical political movement, and the 1908 revolution is just the French Revolution on the Straits, effectively. So no, we're not going to recognise or work with these dangerous radicals. It's not in our interest. And what's even more bizarre...
Can I ask who is responsible for that view? Because the foreign minister, of course, was Edward Grey, and then you have figures like Nicholson as permanent undersecretary. I think he was undersecretary at that time, and the prime minister was Herbert Asquith. None of these men would have some sort of, I don't know, some ideological hostility directed against a constitutionalist movement within the Turkish Empire. So I wonder where that extreme denunciation really comes from. Is it actually part of the whole Kaiserphobia, where they believe that a Muslim empire becoming more sort of sovereign and liberal might have a knock-on effect within the British Empire? Is that the reason?
But there's actually another reading section I wanted to do, which actually elaborates on this further. So I think I'll go ahead and do that, and that might clear things up. So it must have been particularly disappointing for the Young Turks that Great Britain, which most of them admired as the world's leading liberal power, so manifestly failed to rise to the occasion. It was one thing to fail to anticipate the Young Turk Revolution. It was quite another to misread it after it occurred. And yet the British embassy in Pera seemed almost willfully determined to misunderstand what had happened in July 1908, and even more so the implications of the counter-revolution of April 1909. The British ambassador to the Porte, Sir Gerald Lowther, fell under the spell of his first dragoman, General Fitzmaurice, true blue anti-Semite who detested the CUP almost from every outset. So just to give a bit more clarity, there's this kind of conspiracy going on where it's believed that the Young Turks are all Donmer. And for those who don't know, Donmer are Jews in the Ottoman Empire who converted to Islam but still retained many Jewish religious practices and beliefs. And there's this conspiracy that all the Young Turks are these crypto-Jewish revolutionaries. And this seems to inform part of the British ambassador's sort of dislike of them, because he subscribes to this belief, essentially. But I'll carry on. So
no, it's interesting and, again, bizarre. I don't understand. Again, it just seems we were talking about various sort of ministers and sort of Ottoman, German-Ottoman agents provocateurs going rogue. Well, this seems to me diplomats going rogue, because I don't believe that the mainstream British establishment would have many objections to any of those things. But there we are.
No, certainly. History is sometimes inexplicable, but there we are. So endorsing every single crackpot popular rumour about the CUP's origins in crypto-Jewish Freemasonry, Fitzmaurice prepared a thorough report for Lowther in May 1910, which was soon adopted as gospel in the British Foreign Office. The Oriental Jew, according to Fitzmaurice and Lowther, is an adept at manipulating occult forces, and had thus manufactured the CUP conspiracy in order to seize control of the Ottoman Empire. By imitating the French Revolution and its godless and levelling methods, Young Turk internationalists who were proving themselves to be enemies of England and all it stood for.
Is this Sean McMeekin? Sorry.
This is McMeekin, yes.
It's just, this reads like the Protocols of Zion. I'm almost in a sort of state of disbelief that this is coming from the British, because they're the ones who will formulate the Balfour Declaration in 3 years. This is a revelation to me. I'm finding this all fascinating.
I know. I'm also in shock too, to be honest, in considering that prospect. And but it's also interesting because something that Mika does also explored in the book. We mentioned it earlier with Wilhelm's courting of Theodor Herzl, but it's almost interesting that in some way I feel like there's some alternate history out there where Germany could have been the champion of like a creation of Israel or something. I'll carry on. So, okay. The misreading of the Young Turks was the opposite of the truth. As we have seen, many of the CUP officers who had led the original revolution of July 1908 were great admirers of England. Even Enver Bey, who had later become notorious as Germany's man, was still marked by Anglophilia at the time. After Enver heard in early August 1908 that the Sultan's spymaster, Izzet Pasha, had escaped on a British vessel, he personally sought out the British consul in Salonika, Harry Lamb, to warn that aiding and abetting the fugitive would alienate the natural sympathy for England now entertained by the Ottoman nation. The political wing of the movement was even more pro-British, to the extent of wanting to annul the German-Baghdad railway concession and give it to the English firms instead. The biggest Anglophile of all, meanwhile, was David Bey, the Minister of Finance, who went so far as to propose a permanent alliance with Britain in 1911. According to Fitzmaurice and Lowther, however, David was a crypto-Jew who stood at the apex of Freemasonry in Turkey. Although Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, was willing to entertain the alliance idea, the Foreign Office, influenced by Fitzmaurice, said no. If the British misreading of the Young Turks as crypto-Jew internationalists during the period of liberal constitutionalist euphoria was at least vaguely plausible, the failure to read the political shift after April 1909 was simply baffling. True, there were widespread rumours about the CUP's Donma connections following the overthrow of the Sultan Caliph, which the German embassy picked up too, but Marshall's interpretation was almost the polar opposite of Fitzmaurice's. The very fact that the CUP was suspected by ordinary Muslims of fronting for Jewish or foreign interests meant, in Marshall's view, that the Young Turks would have to move sharply to the right, that is, towards Ottoman Muslim nationalism. As Marshall wrote to Berlin in April 1911, Islamic reactionaries had to come to the fore in the movement. Fitzmaurice's crypto-Jewish bogeyman, David Bey, was eventually denounced at the CUP Congress that month because he was suspected of fronting for Zionist interests, supporting the privileged positions of Jews in the Ottoman Empire, and not least of Freemasonry. All in all, the CUP platform, approved by 180 delegates on the 22nd of April 1911, was, Marshall wrote, of a strong Islamic reactionary character. So, turning their backs entirely on their origins, the Young Turk Committee in the capital even vowed to crack down on Judaic Freemason elements prevailing in the CUP local in Salonika. Whether the Young Turks' reactionary turn was just for show or not, it was encouraging for Berlin. Baron Marshall could barely contain his glee in reporting on the April 1911 CUP Congress, which seems to suggest that Pan-Islam was back in force after its temporary eclipse in 1908 to 1909. Abdul Hamid's dramatic fall had turned him into an international martyr of Islam and an albatross around the neck of the Young Turks who had exiled him. Just as the mutineers screamed for Sharia on the 13th of April, Marshall wrote, so has the parliamentary majority now taken on the slogan as its own. The German gamble on the bloody Sultan had not been in vain after all. The Germans, we might say, had supported Abdul Hamid for the wrong reasons, and they would now support the Young Turks for the wrong reasons too. It is curious to reflect that the brief period of constitutional rule and religious tolerance after the July 1908 events coincided with the eclipse of German power at the port. The return to chauvinistic, nationalistic Islamic reaction after the April counter-revolution put the Germans right back in the saddle. After a long pause during the political crisis of 1908 to 9, construction on the Baghdad Railway resumed in March 1910. Promote the Baghdad Railway, Turkophile journalist Ernst Juck then organised a VIP tour of Germany for CUP leaders and penned a classic primer promoting Germany to Turkey to German investors and railway workers, the Rising Crescent. Just as the Germans had come around to support them only after they had jettisoned their ideals, so the Young Turks accepted this aid mostly for pragmatic reasons. Like all successful revolutionary movements, the CUP inherited the same problems which had faced the old regime, with even less political legitimacy to tackle them. The finances were even worse shaped now than under Abdul Hamid, where the Sultan had raised import duties from 8 to 11% before the July Revolution. The Young Turks would hike them still further in September 1909 to 15%. Even so, the pinch remained acute, with revenue so tight that the Young Turks were forced to abrogate all kilometric guarantees in the new Baghdad railway deal, negotiated in 1910. Remarkably, the Germans still took on the concession, despite mounting evidence the Ottoman Empire was effectively bankrupt. Deutsche Bank even fronted a major new loan of 160 million francs to Turkey in December 1910, after Britain and France had balked. German armament firms, including Krupp, also signed new contracts with the port, worth hundreds of millions of marks, on which payment had to be laggered. The difficulties faced by the Ottomans and Germans can be summed up in the ambitious overhaul of the military base at Uskap, now Macedonian capital of Skopje. Beginning in June 1912, the German firm of F.H. Schmidt began working on upgrading what was intended as the linchpin of Ottoman Europe. By the end of the year, the port had ceased payments to F.H. Schmidt on Serbian troops had overrun Uskap and Ottoman Europe, had substantially ceased to exist. At many different levels, this sort of experience made the Ottoman-German relationship hard to manage. For better or for worse, the Germans were in Turkey for good now, and not evidently for profit. So, as we can see there, I think ultimately what Mimika is trying to argue is that the Young Turks, they've got ostensibly quite liberal and reformist, but because the main liberal power, the British, refused to recognise or work with them, this completely discredited them. And so, well, if the only other power we have any kind of strong relationship with is the Germans, then we need to move towards the position that they want. If Wilhelm and the Germans want us to be, Islamic jihadists, then I guess we'll have to do that to maintain that relationship.
I mean, this is actually one of the few times on any of these streams, either guest streams or mine, where I'm almost completely incredulous. Because forgive my ignorance, I do forget a huge amount, but Edmund Fitzmaurice was not just because I was thinking of Nicholson and Crowe. Well, Fitzmaurice was the Under Secretary of Foreign Affairs, who was actually offered the position of Foreign Secretary by Campbell Bannerman, and he was also the Under Secretary during the time of William Gladstone, specifically the time of the second premiership or second ministry of William Gladstone, when he was responsible for the annexation of Egypt, or rather the protectorship of Egypt. So we're talking about a man who has had literally a sort of a 3 decades long interest in this region. And given the very explicit views of many of the Liberal cabinet and the certain ethnic persuasions of many of the British elites at that time, I'm in the rare position of almost thinking I need to go and I need to research this on my own because it's so out of step with everything that I've sort of read up until this point. And just reading his Wikipedia page now, there is not a single reference to any of this. And given the state of Wikipedia, that would basically be the only reference if this were the case. So I might have to go over and fact check this account by Sean McMeekin, because, like I said, I've read his all of his books on Russian and Soviet history. So this is all coming as with his account of Wilhelm II, which I actually thought was very playing into sort of very old tropes regarding his character, sort of old historiography, sort of going back sort of 40 years. I need corroboration in order to justify this, because it's all too much of a revelation to me to just take full in this sort of full-fisted revisionism that's coming out.
Well, I'll take it as a compliment that a stream of mine has sort of left Apostolic Majesty sort of flawed somewhat. But I know that we certainly go and read, and that maybe we could discuss it at some point in the future. But so going on from that, so obviously, Ahmad Riza is main leader really at this point, because he's the president of the Chamber of Deputies from 1908 to 1911. But just to put this in perspective, if all you're saying is, if Sean McMeekin, everything he is saying is correct about Edmund Fitzmaurice, then it puts the whole triple entente in a completely different light. Let's put it that way. No, it certainly does. But then, of course, as we've alluded to, later on, the Three Pashas come in a queue in 1913, and so ultimately, despite them pivoting towards the Germans, it was not by any means guaranteed that the Young Turks and the Ottomans would join the war on Germany's side. I mean, I've mentioned these sort of embarrassments in 1908, and then, of course, you've alluded to the Balkan Wars, but the Balkan Wars obviously would further humiliate the empire. And as I mentioned earlier, what seems even more bizarre is Wilhelm is championing the Greek interest. So I think Albania shouldn't be an autonomous Ottoman province. It should be a Greek possession, which would just further alienate him from the Young Turks. And what's really interesting is, despite the fact that British completely scorning the Young Turks, they are still ultimately canvassing around the other great powers to see, because ultimately, I think the only real alternative to the Ottomans joining the war on Germany's side would have been their neutrality. I can't really think of an example of them joining the Entente, unless, just to give one example, I believe if Italy had actually honoured their alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary and entered the war on their side, you could perhaps maybe see the Ottomans going over to the Entente, using it as an opportunity to recover their possessions they just lost them a couple of years ago. But it's for that exact reason why I possibly believe the Italians ultimately didn't go to war in 1914, probably quite wisely. What's your thought on that?
I mean, the Italians went to war in 1915 completely self-servingly, but perhaps at the time it was the right view of the Italians to delay their entry and play both sides rather shamelessly, until they could basically decide what territorial gains they may accrue as a result of the war. Um, as for the Ottomans, I mean, the British position towards them does seem rather inexplicable. I've always viewed it not for the reasons that Sean McMeekin has brought up at all. I've always seen it as a consequence of the Russian alliance. In a word, you had to ensure that there had to be some stability in Iran, Afghanistan, and normalization of relations after the proxy war, which was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Russia would better serve sort of British interests in those theatres compared to propping up the Ottoman Empire. So that's how I've always read it. You know, this is one of the rare instances where realpolitik sort of trumps overt sort of liberalism and ignoring the sort of more ideological points that were brought up there. The only other power I would see having an all-pervasive interest in the region is the French. But I actually think if you look at it more sort of closely, the underlying logic of the whole sort of entente surrounding the Ottoman Empire would have, I hate to say inevitably because I don't like tautologies in history, or teleologies in history, but it may have precipitated a situation that we saw with the Treaty of Sèvres after the First World War, where you have the partition into spheres of influence. I can very much see that happening either under peacetime. Definitely wouldn't have been advantageous towards the Ottomans.
Certainly not. No, and as I was saying, the Young Turks are sort of canvassing for whatever sort of deals that they can get. Essentially, they're trying to you need to buy our neutrality, essentially, and so there's even a proposed alliance with Russia that's proposed where okay, we'll give you access to the Straits as long as you guarantee us from attack, but that falls through. They even talk to the French about some alliance, but again, the French also reject that as well. And so in terms of entry into war, I mean, as we've mentioned previously, Enver Pasha was the most pro-German voice in the government. And obviously after the coup in 1913, he would eventually sign a secret treaty with Germany on the 2nd of August 1914, but it was still, shall I say, quite dubiously worded to ensure that Germany had to guarantee to protect the Turks against Russian aggression, but the Turks were only obligated to join a war with Germany if Germany did so in defense of Austria. And furthermore, to exacerbate any chance of a British rapprochement with the Turks, when you have the July crisis, the British are actually on commission from the Turks to complete the construction of 2 dreadnought battleships called the Rashadiye and the Sultan Osman I. And what the British decide to do with the July crisis, as they predict a war is going to break out, they decide to not hand these ships over to the Turks as promised, but requisition them for the Royal Navy, and that infuriates Enver Pasha and the Young Turk government. And obviously earlier I mentioned the journey of the German ships, the Gerben and the Breslau. Well, this is where they come in. They're being chased across the Mediterranean by the British. They then obviously enter the port of Constantinople, and the Germans make a show of quote unquote selling the ships to the Ottomans, which obviously the Entente saw through, but it was kind of a propaganda win. You know, evil England, deprives the Turks of the promised ships, and we Germans are going to compensate them. Though the German ships, though they were good, they were not obviously as strong as the 2 dreadnoughts the British had promised. And but further to add to this idea of duplicity, what's interesting is the Ottomans don't just allow the German and the Breslau in for nothing. The Ottoman Grand Vizier Said Pasha makes incredibly huge demands of the Germans before allowing this, because ultimately, by allowing these ships in, you're just signaling to the rest of the world, oh yes, we're on the German side, and it may have precipitated a declaration by the of war by the Entente powers. And so the demands the Ottomans made was that Germany must accept the abolition of all European capitulations within the empire, fair terms if Bulgaria or Romania entered the war, the return of former Ottoman islands from Greece if Greece joins the Entente and was defeated, and also to allow the Ottoman frontiers in Anatolia to expand to Russian Central Asia, and lastly that the Turks would receive a war indemnity. So the Germans agreed to this on the 6th of August, but ultimately these talks last several days, because again, ultimately, the Ottomans are still canvassing out the other powers for anyone else who can give them a counter offer. So despite any semblance of any kind of sentimental attachment, that was very much not the case. The Young Turks are thinking, if we're going to be dragged into war on Germany's side, we absolutely want our interests guaranteed, and I suppose you can't really blame them for that.
I don't think there's any. I think the theme we've been alluding to here, I don't think there's been any sentimentality from the Turks, genuine sentimentality, other than bizarre allusions to the fact that the Quran had predicted the divine intervention of the Islamic Kaiser, which again is a point that all of these sort of bizarre sort of prophetical sort of contrivances and sort of millenarian eschatologies appear sort of wrapped in sort of various guises of points in history. But apart from that, Turkey has basically been in survival mode for the last 150 years, if not 200 years. So it makes complete sense as to why they would ultimately side with the Germans, because it was the only option. As to whether it was actually a benefit to the Germans is another question. I mean, they were able to tie down Russian troops in the Caucasus. They were able to divert British and French attention towards the Levant and towards Iraq, but simultaneously the Germans also had to prop up the Turks. But again, the Germans had to intervene due to the horrific moral outrage, which was the Assyrian genocide, to the point that there was actually an Austro-German intervention to save the last remnants of the Assyrian sort of enclave within the empire. The same could not be said for the Armenians, who of course were sent on death marches throughout the Syrian desert and died in the scores of hundreds of thousands, to the point that we're still estimating how many of them died, which is difficult because the Turks still won't acknowledge that it ever happened. But yeah, it's just one of these sort of great tragic moments in history. It's also kind of bizarre in terms of the radical intercession of the Germans, considering that for such a long time the history of the Ottoman Empire had been its relationship with France. France had basically been the first power to seriously prop up the Ottomans for centuries. We're talking about since the 16th century all the way up until the 18th century. The French were the principal ones propping up the Ottoman Empire in various ways. Then it was the British, and the Russians were seen as the great aggressor, though that again is a very simplistic view, which is historically myopic. The Russians were as interested in carving out the Ottomans for their own purposes as the British and French were. But the bizarre sort of realignment of the powers results in a situation where the Ottomans are forced, without a sense of sentimentality, into the German camp. And that's the situation we have. In the same way that the Italians were not drawn to the Germans or indeed the Entente by any sense of sentimentality. The Italians could have made gains vis-a-vis the French or vis-a-vis the Austrians. As it turned out, they ultimately chose the winning side. But my contention is that the Italians entered the war in perhaps the worst possible state they could have, resulting in massive casualties, which were virtually unnecessary. The same for the Romanians. The Brusilov offensive occurs in 1916. The Romanians think the Austrian Empire is about to crumble. They have designs on the Transylvanian provinces of the empire, so they invade Transylvania. It goes disastrously for them, and most of Austria is occupied, including the oil-producing regions of Romania for the remainder of the war. So it's just a fate of all of these smaller powers that they are drawn to these alliances of temporary convenience other than sentimentality. I mean, just for the Romanian case, the Romanians were even Hohenzollerns. They were even led by a Catholic converted to Orthodox branch of the Romanian house of the Prussian royal family, the House of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. So completely divorced of sentimentality. And what I find bizarre about the Italian declaration of war is that Vittorio Emanuele, for a few days before the declaration, is technically allied to both the Entente and the Central Powers at the same time. So this is a conflict without ideology, without scruples. It's just a series of betrayals and pointless, ensuing, incessant, all-encompassing conflict. But there we are. That's my moralizing about it over.
And it's the generation into just pure cynicism and nothing else. Well, just sort of wrap the stream up. Obviously, need to talk about the final commitment to war, where so Souchon, who was the German commander of the two ships, is made an admiral in the Ottoman fleet, and he, alongside Enver Pasha and Jamal Pasha, decide to launch a preemptive strike on the Russians, where they send the Ottoman fleet with the two German ships into the Black Sea on the 27th of October 1914. So they launched this sort of preemptive strike, and the port then sends an apology to the Russians, but this contains a very insulting passage stating that the Russian aggression is the reason for the attack, and the whole point of that is just to go the Russians into declaring war. By that way, ensuring that the Germans are now guaranteed to come in on the Ottoman side, ultimately. So there you have it. But what's also interesting in terms of Sean McMeekin's assessments, his assessment of this is that he kind of sees it as a kind of like a German-Turkish version of Pearl Harbor, ultimately. But the only difference there is ultimately they had opposite outcomes. Obviously the Japanese, their attack, the whole point of that was to intimidate the Americans into not interfering in their affairs, and that completely backfired on them. Whereas in this sort of surprise attack was there to induce the Russians to declare war. I'm not really sure what I think of this comparison. It just seems a bit silly.
I mean, from all the segments you read out of Sean McMeekin, it's interesting because it's been a great sort of conversation in starter. But I have never been sort of in more fervent disagreement with Sean McMeekin than I have listening to the episodes from your book. So it's been quite interesting. Well, what I will point out regarding Enver Pasha, to sort of contextualize my view about German sentimentality, Enver Pasha was the most pro-German because he wanted his war against Russia. He wanted, as I mentioned, he wanted expansion into Azerbaijan. He wanted expansion into Central Asia. This wasn't purely for ideological pan-Turkic reasons. Baku, I believe, was at this time the biggest oil-producing site in all of Eurasia. I might be wrong.
No. Well, just quickly, the Russians had developed it since the 1860s. I mean, the British base at Abadan, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, had only been established in 1908. So yeah, the Baku was certainly the most developed oil-producing site in the Middle East by that point.
Yeah. So conquering Baku would and the Caucasus would basically push Russia out of the region forever. You even have the possibility of Russia being demilitarized along the Black Sea. I very much doubt restoring a Muslim Crimean Tatar presence, but there we are. So from the point of view of reorienting the empire towards Turkic supremacy and Turkic great power status, it would seem that Enver Pasha's goals were at least coherent in that regard, especially as we're talking at a time where Mesopotamian oil wasn't nearly as a firm prospect as Azerbaijani oil.
And I would say though that the Ottomans did canvass ex sort of exploratory investigations into oil sites. So that was something they were working on. They even had a company called the Turkish Petroleum Company, which after the war, the British took over in Iraq and just simply renamed it the Iraqi Petroleum Company. So all that ended up happening is the Ottomans invested in it, but then we just usurped it from them ultimately.
Yes, I mean there is a very favorable outcome for the Ottomans in this story where the Germans, win a victory in World War One, and then the Ottomans acquire these regions, but the Ottomans also spend their time with German support, logistical and advisory support, putting down the uh, Salafist rebels in Central Arabia, and thereby basically accruing to themselves all of the main sort of oil potential in the world. And you could also see a possibility of the Russo-Anglo oil concessions being reversed and it being replaced by a German-Ottoman series of concessions. So yes, there is a hypothetical here where the Ottomans could have actually emerged as the great oil superpower in the world.
No, certainly, and yeah, that's where I really wanted to leave it. And so thank you so much for coming on, AM. Is there any final thing you wanted to say before we leave?
No, just to say that yeah, it's quite interesting how much fascination sort of paid to this topic. I think it is a combination of all the things that you brought up regarding the sort of faddism about the Kaiser and Orientalism tied to this incredibly violent and genocidal regime of the bloody Sultan himself. So yes, and of course this is the death of both empires. The World War One sees the demise of the Austrian, the Russian, the Ottoman, and the German empires. It is the end of the world as we know it, effectively, and we can never return to the diplomatic sort of situation that we witnessed before, for better or ill. Albeit, I will contend that again, the tragic association of this, the sort of destruction of the relations and the breakdown of the connection between the Christian subjects and the Sultan, and great power interest in this region, leads to some of the bloodiest conflicts in recent history, which is horrifying. And I think it's an interesting question to point at all the European powers who are directly or indirectly culpable for that.
No, absolutely. And just had a couple of super chats, and both from Rong Tao Wu. So, first one for $12. I hope you had a great and fruitful year ahead. I hope you have a great and fruitful year ahead, both in your personal life and this channel. Same thing for Hunger and AM. Or thank you very much. And also, he sends another one for $5. The situation was such an extent that Ion Dragumis believed that Greeks can become the dominant class again instead of going the Venizelos route. Oh, he's talking about Greece, isn't he?
Venizelos, yes, I assume he is.
Who's Dragumis? I know Venizelos was the prime minister, but who was Dragumis?
I'll look him up quickly.
Sorry.
Contrary to popular myth, I'm actually very, very, very forgetful. According to Wikipedia, he was a Greek diplomat and philosopher who was assassinated in 1920. So I'm not sure. Oh, okay. It's relating to the Young Turks and the conflict over Salonika in 1908. That's what I think
Oh,
it's
right.
referring to.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, sorry, because you covered the sort of the Greeks in one of your streams. What was it? The Full Storm, the Greater Greece. I thought you might have known who he was, but silly me.
Well, in fairness, I forget everything. So it's very possible. No, I don't believe I covered him in the discussion. I covered Venizelos, not extensively, but I definitely referenced him. We were mainly talking about the Treaty of Sèvres and the the Greco-Turkish War and things like that. So I'm not necessarily exactly sure what. Oh no, he's trying to confirm it here. By Venizelos, he is also the main one in charge over the Macedonian situation. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was also a way for the Phanariotes to get back into the empire. Well, my contention has always been that that was dead. That was a completely dead path by the time that we get to the 1930s. I don't see there was any opportunity. When we're talking about the false dawn of Greater Greece, going back to that electorated discussion a very long time ago now, it should be mentioned. My claim was basically that this was the final sort of severing of relations between the Turks and the Greeks, because they had both lived alongside each other for nearly a millennia up until that point. But the genocide and the ethnic sort of removals basically ensured that the two nations shall remain, forever separate. The Phanariot, and it goes back to the Phanariotes, because the Phanariotes were empowered within the Ottoman Empire for much of the 18th century, to the point that they basically became the sort of the imperial elite under the Sultan, because you can't look at the Ottoman Empire as a Turkish empire. But the betrayal of the Philikiyteria and groups and figures such as Ypsilantis and later Capodistrias meant that the reaction from, I believe it was Sultan Mahmud, was so extreme, it basically resulted in the elimination, the liquidation of all the sort of Phanariotes notables within Constantinople, within the original Phanar. And part of the process of the 19th century for the Ottoman Empire is something I alluded to just now, which is the great power intervention resulting in the demise of this relationship. And the Phanariotes is the exemplar of that. And it's convenient in many ways that it starts with the Greeks and it ends with the Greeks.
No, certainly. Thank you. Okay, so is there anything you would like to shill before we get out of here?
No, just to say thank you for having me on. I just saw the discussion was happening and thought, yeah, this might be fun to talk about the Drang, Nach, Osman, because yeah, why not? always a good opportunity. Always a good opportunity to talk to you.
No, thank you. And it was originally going to be more of a talk or a lecture, but your partaking has turned it into a discussion, and I'm indebted to you for that. I think it's made it all the more interesting if it was just me rambling and reading at people. So in terms of this channel, the main thing people know I'm working on is a series on modern Iran with my good friend Hunger the Dye Merchant. The next stream we hope to do is next Saturday. We'll be looking at the Iranian constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1912. Lesser known event of Iranian history. Everybody only seems to know about the 79 revolution, but the one in the early 20th century is just as important. And so yeah, please give that a watch. And also in terms of the stream I've done today, obviously I've got most of this idea from reading this Meekin book again, but if people are interested, I'm really tempted to do a follow-up to this, looking at the actual Germans and Ottomans during World War I, specifically looking at the actual attempt to implement, this Kaiser jihad, if you will, and the actions of these various, agents provocateurs throughout Persia, Egypt, Iraq, etc. So if people want that, I'll certainly cover that. But thank you everybody for watching, and good night.
Good night.